Duke Roderick Elmheim stood on the battlefield among hundreds of enemies he had slain, his magical power blazing furiously around him. His wounded adopted son approached him from behind, and the Duke asked if it was Ash. Roderick was puzzled as to why the boy was here. It seemed he had entrusted him with the command of the Eastern expedition. The boy was silent for a moment, and then angrily replied that he was here to strike him down. Duke Roderick. The head of the Elmheim house turned to the young man and looked at him with bewilderment. Ash told the Duke that he had intended from the very beginning to use the boy's squad as bait and then leave them there to die. Ash's eyes flashed with anger, and he asked his adoptive father if his assumption was correct. Roderick chuckled and asked his foolish son if that was the only use for the wingless. Wasn't he right? And he, Isha A. Elmheim, knows this very well. The Elmheim family is the greatest warrior house on the continent, offering their swords as protectors to the royal family. Its leader, Roderick A. Elmheim, was the only one in the land with 7 wings. On a whim, when little Ash was dying in a snowstorm, Roderick saved him. That's why Ash did everything he could to repay the Duke for saving him. But Roderick's own sons constantly reminded Ash not to get cocky, for he was a wingless, crestless brat. Ash didn't have wings to prove his worth to his father. The wing emblem appeared on the back, and the more wings there were, the more magical power it concealed. As the only one in the Duke's family who could not use magic, Ash's brothers called him wingless. And yet, Ash simply continued to swing his sword with unwavering devotion. From an early age, the boy trained constantly, developing and strengthening his strong young body. Ash was physically much stronger than many, and he believed that one day his perseverance would be rewarded. And so the adoptive father, whom Ash idolized, sent him and his squad to certain death. Ash managed to take cover and notice the huge number of enemies. Only because of this, he was able to repel many attacks and survive. The young man asked Duke Elmheim why they had been lured into an ambush. He reminded his father that he followed him and trusted him implicitly. Was this really his answer? Roderick told the guy with a grin that he was just a tool. What did he expect? If his role was played, then it was time to disappear. A shadow fell across the wounded boy's face. He never expected such cynicism from his adoptive father. He clutched his sword and rushed at the head of the Elmheim ducal house, hoping to finish off the scoundrel. Ash finally realized what a fool he had been to trust his adoptive father, the High Duke Roderick Elmheim. The boy flew up to the Duke and struck him with his bloody sword. Roderick grinned. The sword of the desperate Ash slashed across his collar, leaving a mark. Magic protected the Duke. At that moment, Roderick's own sons pounced on Ash, binding the boy with a magical blood chain. One of the half-brothers cut off the boy's hand, the other cut off his leg, and the young man was mortally wounded. Ash's mouth was gushing blood from the wounds he had received, yet his eyes still glowed with an uncontrollable rage. One of the brothers told Ash that his brothers still didn't understand anything. In the end, he remains wingless, which is what he was all this time. The second added that the eternal fate of the insignificant wingless one is to crawl on the earth in darkness. Gathering his last strength, Ash asked the Duke if he was going to throw him away anyway. Then why did he pick him up? Roderick approached the mortally wounded foster son and told him not to flatter himself. The Duke had no use for him from the very beginning. He lifted the bloody youth's head by the hair and grinned cruelly into his eyes. Roderick Elmheim quietly told the boy that all he needed was the power of the 7 wings that resided within Ash's body. The boy, overcoming the pain, asked in surprise what power of 7 wings the Duke was talking about. He laughed. Ash's mother was truly useful, because she gave birth to such a brat for him. Duke Elmheim abandoned the boy and walked away, instructing his sons to finish off this idiot. Ash shouted at the Duke to stop. The boy didn't understand what Roderick was even talking about now, and the Duke's own sons zealously took up the task of fulfilling their father's will, plunging their swords one after another into the body of the chained and wounded Ash. And then the snow under Ash's body melted and turned into a scarlet mess. The boy felt that he was very cold. Life was leaving the young man's body along with the last drops of blood. He wondered if he would really die here. But if it all ends like this, then what did he live for all this time? Suddenly, the guy's feelings changed. He felt that everything around was white and slightly warm. He wondered if this was the afterlife. Apparently, it could snow there. Ash spat out a snowflake that had flown into his mouth and tried to sit up, but for some reason he couldn't do it. Suddenly he realized, no, that's not it. This is reality. He is still on Earth. The young man cursed mentally, wondering where he had ended up and what had happened in just a couple of seconds. He twitched his arms and legs. This tiny body, could it really be his? But how could this happen? Ash raised his hand up. It was very tiny and plump, just like a baby's. And then it dawned on him. Wait, so it turns out he is a baby. Could it be that he was reborn again? He glanced sideways at the body lying next to him. It was from it that he felt a faint warmth. Ash realized it was a woman, but she seemed to be dead. And while dying, she covered him with herself to warm him up at least a little. And then Ash heard voices. Someone was ordering them to continue the search. They had to find this woman at any cost. There was the sound of horses clattering and a commanding voice saying that in such a snowstorm she could not have gone far. The search party leader reminded everyone that for the sake of Mr. Roderick, they must return the baby she had taken. Ash frowned. What just happened? It turns out they were deliberately looking for the baby, and the mother was trying to save him from Roderick. The writers said about Mr. Roderick that he wanted to return the child. Then it dawned on Ash that they were looking for him. He had heard as a child that he too had been picked up on the same snowy night. But is it possible that Ash returned to the past? This is just nonsense. Who would believe such a thing? But the sound of horses' hooves was getting closer, which meant there was very little time left. Ash decided that he would check it out later. But for now, he needed to get out of here before Roderick's servants found him and his mother. He tried to get out from under his mother's dead hand, realizing that if he stayed here, then he would definitely fall into the hands of the Duke. The baby frowned and crawled forward with all his might through the deep snow, pushing it aside with his little hands. He knew he had to get as far away from here as possible. The baby's body was ablaze with magic, giving him strength. His body became so hot that the snow in his little hands instantly melted. Ash cursed. It was hard to breathe. It seemed like this body was still too small to withstand such stress. And yet he continued to crawl, feeling that his body and limbs were somehow burning. The guy chuckled to himself. Yes, his whole life had been one continuous crawl, but he still intended to survive. Since fate had given him another chance, he had to take advantage of it. Before his mind's eye stood Roderick, the adoptive father who had betrayed him. Ash mentally promised Roderick that he would definitely find him and avenge all his atrocities. Driven by a thirst for revenge, Ash, in the body of a baby, continued to crawl forward, moving further and further away from the corpse of his mother. By morning, the child was almost exhausted and fell asleep at the feet of a girl who had gone outside. The surprised girl called out to her father, pointing to the baby in the snow. Her father turned out to be Viscount Highfried, Roderick's older brother, and he looked at the boy in surprise. Hayfried took the baby in his arms and asked where a baby could have come from. The man examined the child. He was completely fine, only very tired and fell asleep immediately. The Viscount looked at the trace left by this extraordinary child and was dumbfounded. If Hayfried hadn't seen it with his own eyes, he would never have believed that it was real. The Viscount frowned. Who was this child who possessed such incredible power? And the baby was sleeping. He looked like a very ordinary boy. Ash woke up and suddenly saw some chubby child reaching out to him. He didn't understand where he was. Could it be that this red-haired child came for him? Maybe he is an angel, and he will send him to heaven. But for some reason, the child grabbed Ash by the nose, and he chuckled in surprise. Strange behavior for an angel. The redhead shouted to her sister that this baby had just woken up, but she shouldn't make fun of him. Otherwise, his cute little nose would fall off. The children were making noise and pulling Ash by the arms and legs, and he was perplexed as to what was going on here. The older sister picked up the baby and demanded that the others leave him alone. Suddenly, the foundling jumped out of the older girl's arms and ran away. All the girls looked at the boy in surprise. Ash couldn't walk in this body yet, but he crawled across the floor with surprising dexterity, not understanding what the hell was going on. One of the girls called out to the baby and ran after him. All the girls ran after the little ones and shouted for him to stop. But Ash couldn't understand why they were chasing him. Trying to save himself, the boy stretched out his hand and his body was instantly engulfed in magical currents. He didn't even realize what had happened. He just felt that everything around him suddenly became noisy. Finally, Ash realized that for some reason he had flown to a fairly decent height. Looking down, the guy saw that he had broken through the roof of the house. He wondered if it was magical power, but he couldn't control it, and began to fall at great speed. The boy desperately waved his little hands, trying to figure out how to control the flight. Ash closed his eyes in fear. The ground was already close, and he didn't know how he could soften his fall. But Hayfried caught him. He was surprised. Just think. This time the baby fell from the sky. He really is a strange baby. Ash looked at the face of the man who saved him and flinched. He immediately recognized him. It was Viscount Hayfried, Duke Roderick's elder brother. The guy thought, this can't be. Could this really be another house of the Elmheim family? Hayfried Elmheim is the current head of the Elmheim branch of the Viscount house, and once stood beside Roderick. But Viscount Hayfried, whom Ash knew, was to die in that civil war, after which his house fell. Now Ash was absolutely sure that he had returned to the past, because here Hayfried was still alive. But who would have thought that while trying to escape from Roderick, Ash would end up being picked up by his older brother? The Viscount's wife took the baby in her arms and asked if this meant that the child was flying because his magical power was out of control. Hayfried replied, "It seems that he is a very unusual baby." The woman smiled welcomingly at the child. She kissed the boy on the forehead and asked if he was probably scared. But now everything is fine. The woman gently patted the boy and stroked his disheveled hair. The Viscount looked tenderly at his beloved wife, who was distinguished by her amazing kindness. Hayfried told his wife that this child hides within himself enormous magical power. It is immediately clear. He lifted his shirt and added that the mark on his back was proof of that. The Viscount's wife went to the mirror and looked at the baby's small back. Ash saw the mark and was stunned. 7 wings. But why are there these 7 wings on his body? When all his life he was called wingless. Ash frowned, suddenly remembering Roderick's words before he ordered his sons to kill Ash. The Duke said that he only needed the power of the 7 wings that resided in this body. Now everything became clear to the guy. This is the very reason why Roderick picked him up that winter's snowy night in the forest. The Duke had only one goal. He took the baby only to steal his 7 wings. Ash clenched his fists. So much for being wingless. After Roderick himself tore out Ash's wings, how dare he say all those nasty things? The woman asked her husband, "So what are they going to do with this child? He is still very small." Hayfried thought about it. Up until now, there had only been girls in their family. Ash became wary. Things were bad. He needed to get ready to escape from this house too. He cannot let his power fall into the hands of the Elmheims. He needs this power himself to take revenge on Duke Roderick. Hayfried replied to his wife that he would accept the boy as his adopted son. Ash stared at the Viscount in surprise. This was unexpected for the kid. The Viscount extended a strong hand to the child and gently stroked his hair. He told his wife that this child was still a chick and was not yet able to fly on its own. Until the boy decides to fly of his own free will, Hayfried will take on the responsibility of looking after him. Ash stared at the Viscount, unable to believe that he was so different from his brother Roderick. Suddenly, the door swung open with a loud noise, and all 5 girls tumbled into the room. The father sternly asked them if they had been eavesdropping at the door. The eldest daughter guiltily justified herself by saying that they were simply worried about this strange child. One of the girls ran up to her mother, who was holding in her arms the baby who had run away from them. The girl asked her mother what the child's name was. None of them knew the boy's real name. The woman smiled. She had to think about what they would call him. She held the baby high and said, "Aster. That is the name of the new star born in their house." 10 years passed. Viscount Hayfried, along with Aster and one of his daughters, came to the sword dance festival. The organizer bowed to Lord Hayfried, saying that they had been waiting for them. The carriage door opened, and the Viscount's 10-year-old adopted son, Aster, emerged behind him. By that time, he had already grown into a tall, slender boy. Aster gallantly offered his hand to his sister and asked Alfina to watch her step. The girl thanked her younger brother with a smile for his kind help. Over the years, the red-haired, chubby-cheeked baby has transformed into a bright, graceful beauty with long, fiery hair. The boys, along with their father, Viscount Hayfried, went to the Sword Dance Festival. It was an annual event held by a certain ducal house under the patronage of the Elmheims, a social gathering for the families of military nobles. And although this event is designed to strengthen ties, it is still a competition. During the festival, each house presents aspiring swordsmen who showcase their talents. The Viscount and his children walked with a firm step across the wide courtyard towards the site of the Sword Dance Festival. Behind the backs of Highfried and the boys, angry voices were heard. They were here. People from the Viscount's house. Have they come again to display their barren lands without having learned their lesson? Instead of an heir who was never born, they seem to have adopted a boy of unknown origin. I wonder how much longer Highfried is going to drag Elmheim's name into the mud. And this is that guy, the Viscount's adopted son. Alfina quietly told Brother Aster that he shouldn't pay attention to it. The girl clenched her hand into a fist and added that if Aster showed weakness, he would be immediately trampled into the dirt. The young man could clearly see how much these dismissive conversations hurt his little sister Alfina. Highfried said bitterly, "This is, unfortunately, the current state of the Viscount's house." He paused and turned to his adopted son. He wanted to show the boy the real state of affairs. The Viscount asked Aster if he was probably disappointed with the way they were treated here, but he flashed his eyes and replied, "No, father. This kind of cold is just what I like." Highfried laughed. He noticed that this was very encouraging. In his past life, as a disgrace to the Elmheim family, Ash made the worst possible debut here, a place of bitter memories. But now that his 7 wings were with him, the boy was sure that everything would change. The young man's eyes were shining. He was looking forward to meeting his brothers from his past life and their father. He walked next to his excited little sister and noble adoptive father. Roderick Elmheim's sons watched their eldest uncle and his children closely from the window. Aster looked up and saw them, the ones who had cut him down with swords in his past life, when he was Ash. The guy thought, well, to begin with, why don't they make a spectacular debut in high society? The young man's hands were itching to deal with those who had turned his past life into hell and then treacherously killed him. In the ring, young noblemen fought fiercely with each other, demonstrating their skills while the rest discussed the fights. In an era when knights ruled the world, they were expected to possess both strength and grace. Therefore, young people strove to demonstrate their art of war as early as possible. At that time, strength was expressed in the art of swordsmanship, and skilled swordsmen were highly valued. Of no small importance was also elegance, which often brought knights resounding glory. The young men fought desperately in the ring, aware that hundreds of eyes were watching them closely. Almost all knights from noble families had that very coveted symbol of power, which they were proud of. These were wings, the so-called wing crest, showing the level of power of its owner. The more wings, the higher the warrior's potential, the greater heights he can achieve in the art of war. Those who had fewer wings or no wings at all had a hard time fighting against winged opponents. Even in their teens, those with wings usually won confident victories in all competitions. The wing's coat of arms was the highest sign of strength, glory, and success among all warriors of the empire. Highfried, Alfina, and Aster watched the duels of the young knights from the balcony. The girl remarked that, as always, it was impressive. It's no wonder Alfina's sisters Flynn and Flare didn't want to come here. And Ash remembered how they laughed at him in his past life when he debuted at this sword dance festival. Then he was incredibly humiliated by one of Duke Roderick's sons, who broke his sword and inflicted several wounds. Alfina noticed that her brother was deep in thought about something. She quietly called out to Aster. The girl decided that Aster was nervous, after all. This was his first sword dance festival. The young man replied that he was not particularly worried, and mentally added that it rather evoked nostalgia. Alfina looked questioningly at her younger brother. She couldn't understand what was going on in his head. Highfried said that he had to go to the meeting and he was leaving Alfina in Aster's care. The girl was indignant. How could this be? She was a year older than Aster. The guy noticed with a smile that his little sister was a little absent-minded. The Viscount told Aster that there were many children his age here, and he could use this chance to expand his circle of acquaintances. As he passed by, Highfried whispered to the boy, "Just make sure no one finds out about the 7 wings." The young man looked after the departing Viscount and thought, "It's easy to say, Alfina was beside herself with indignation. Most of the young aristocrats in the festival hall openly hated the children of Viscount Highfried Elmheim. Aster looked around and noticed that it was difficult to communicate when the atmosphere was so openly hostile. And then the young man's attention was drawn to his old enemies, the native sons of Duke Roderick Elmheim. He immediately headed towards them. Alfina asked Aster where he was going. The guy, without turning around, replied that he was going to make friends. Roderick's sons sat comfortably on the sofa, surrounded by their henchmen, sipping wine. Aster approached Darius, who chuckled and asked the young man in surprise who he was. The boy told his brother Darius that he was glad to meet him. The young man smiled broadly and introduced himself as Aster F. Elmheim, his younger brother. Darius frowned and grimaced, and Aster said with a smile that he saw relatives and decided to say hello. Roderick's second son explained to his brother that this was the adopted child who had been taken in by the Viscount's family. Darius chuckled. Ah, I see. So that's why he has the nerve to use F in his name. Darius and Grion are both the rightful heirs of House Elmheim, and the ones who killed Ash in his past life. The young man was perplexed, looking at his brothers. Just think. He used to be deathly afraid of them. Duke Roderick's sons, Darius and Grion, are children who diligently play at being adults. Suddenly, Aster heard his sister's voice behind him. She called out to her younger brother. The girl took his hand and said that he had already said hello and that they needed to go back. Darius exclaimed, "Oh, and Alfina is here too." He sarcastically asked the girl if she really had to hide behind her father's back today. Roderick's son said, "Why doesn't she come and entertain them? It's the order of the main house." The girl proudly replied that she refused. There was no master-servant relationship between the main and secondary branches. But Aster asked his sister to wait. He had not yet finished talking with the Duke's sons. He suddenly felt his sister's hand trembling. She was very afraid and hated these dissolute relatives. The young man frowned. He realized that Viscount Highfried's family had to endure a lot from these scoundrels. A pleased Darius exclaimed, "Did you know that their father couldn't even protect the king, even though he was a knight?" Hayfried had to let his own brother cut off his hand to take responsibility. Alfina's face darkened and she suddenly stopped, and Darius laughed merrily, saying that he was very glad that the blood of such a loser did not flow in his veins. Alfina ran up to her cousin and demanded that he take his words back. She would not allow her father to be insulted. Instead of answering, Darius spat wine at her, to the silent, mocking approval of those around him. The bastard chuckled. Her father must be disappointed that he only has useless daughters who can't even inherit the title. He remarked contemptuously to his cousin that this was not a dance hall for her. Darius mockingly advised Alfina to wear some rags next time so she wouldn't have to worry about getting wet. Ash admitted to himself that he was worried until he came here. He was worried that when he saw the faces of his former relatives again, he would not feel anger at all. Having laughed their fill at the humiliated girl, the teenagers took up the wine bottles again. Aster walked up to his sister and put his hand on her shoulder. It was time for him to start paying. The young man called out to the cheerful Darius, waving his hand, and Aster knocked the wine bottle out of the major's hands. Roderick's son frowned and caught the vessel of choice red wine that flew out of his hands. Ash was very glad that these guys remained the same scum. He cut the wine bottle in Darius's hands. A stream of red liquid poured over the head and shirt of the stunned heir of Duke Roderick. Grion rushed towards his brother, and Aster ran his hand over the dirty blade. After tasting the liquid, the young man grinned. "Oh, it's just grape juice." The Viscount's adopted son laughed, which was just right for such a spoiled aristocrat, wasn't it? 3 years ago, during training, Aster's magical power became especially strong, and the Viscount told him to restrain himself. The older sister tearfully asked Aster if he was really going to kill his sisters. Kudo was unconscious. Her older sister carried her away. The other girls were terrified. The young man realized that these were the 7 wings. Just think. They hid such a dangerous power in his body. The Viscount looked at the terrifying power of his pupil and wondered if he would be able to control such might. Highfried looked at the boy and wondered if Aster could learn to control his magic, and if he could help him. A festival official opened the door to the meeting room and reported to the gentleman that trouble had occurred. The main organizer asked angrily what was going on. He was having a meeting. Why did someone dare to burst in here? The guy explained that the main and secondary branches of the Elmheim family, the sons of both families, had a duel. Hayfried frowned and asked the boy if he had mixed something up. Roderick remained silent. He knew very well the attitude of his sons towards the children of Viscount Hayfried. The Viscount jumped up and quickly headed to the hall where the sword dance festival was taking place. A frightened Alfina ran towards him. The Viscount asked his daughter what was going on here. The main organizer was very pleased. At the festival, a quarrel occurred between brothers from the noble Elmheim family. Aster and Darius were already standing opposite each other in the arena. Everyone couldn't take their eyes off them, of course. You don't see something like that every day. Almost all the meeting participants came out onto the balconies and watched the young gentleman with interest. No one wanted to miss such a fascinating spectacle, although many were sure that Darius would win. The organizers smiled broadly. This sword dance festival promises to be hot. Darius exclaimed with a laugh. What an idiot! He climbed on us, members of the Duke's family. Because the boy is just a mongrel, born in the wilderness. Those present began to whisper. This is the emblem of 4 wings. As expected from the son of the Duke, she is on a completely different level. Darius suggested that the enemy show everyone his wing emblem, or he would be ashamed to show it after Darius showed his. Aster replied, Darius was right. It was such a shameful sight to boast about some kind of pattern, as if there was something to be proud of in it. The young man noted that he could never do that. But if his cousin lost, he would have to apologize to his sister Alfina. Darius was twisted with anger. What was this bastard allowing himself to do, humiliating him here in front of everyone? Roderick's son replied, Okay, but if he wins, then Aster will be his dog, and he will run him to death. Having said this, Darius, armed with 2 swords, rushed at the adopted son of Viscount Hayfried. The Duke's young heir charged at Aster, his eyes blazing with bloodlust, eager to teach the upstart a lesson. But Aster successfully repelled the attacks, trying not to use his devastating magical power. The young man's hands were shaking from the tension. It took him a great deal of effort to restrain himself, as his adoptive father had taught him. And Darius exclaimed arrogantly, so that the childless one could admire it. This is the power of those who have wings. He attacked his opponent again and again. Darius was confident that he would easily win this fight. Alfina screamed anxiously from the balcony. She was very worried about her little brother. The festival organizer noticed that young Darius's swordsmanship was still crude, but no matter how clumsy he may be, the magical power that makes up for this gap is the advantage of those with the wing crest. If the magic of one wing is like the light of a candle, that magical power hidden in the 4 wings is truly the light from an entire explosion. Darius cheerfully asked his opponent where all his ardor had gone. He reminded Aster that he wanted to force Darius to apologize to Alfina, or that it was just chatter. Swinging 2 flaming swords at Aster, Darius shouted for the kinless one to show what he was capable of. The spectators were sure that the outcome of the duel was predetermined. The owner of 4 wings would certainly defeat the boy. But despite such confidence, Aster clenched his sword in his hand and blocked his cousin's attack. Darius's furious attack, which he intended to use to finish the fight, was stopped. Roderick's son couldn't believe it. None of his peers could stand against his 2 swords. Aster calmly noted that Darius talked too much more than he actually did. He threw the arrogant Darius away from himself. The whole hall gasped in amazement. It was too unexpected. The 10-year-old boy's magic flared menacingly, but he was still able to contain it. He spent those 10 years in the Viscount's house, learning to control magic, and only waiting for the chance to take revenge on all his enemies. And today, the guy could finally begin his long-awaited revenge on those who ruined his past life. Now Aster was attacking, and the confused Darius was defending himself, still not believing that he could lose. Under the harsh pressure of the Viscount's adopted son, the arrogant Darius fell to one knee. Grian frowned as he saw his brother losing to some adopted son of the Viscount. Roderick's son was puzzled as to whether this puppy was actually fighting back, and how that was even possible. Darius smiled confidently and reminded the boy that he was the owner of the 4-winged crest. Aster looked with disdain at the one he once called his brother. The young man's sword was burning furiously, and suddenly Darius saw with horror that his swords were beginning to crumble under the pressure of magic. The young aristocrats watching the duel were shocked. Was the boy really going to win like that? Everyone could clearly see that Darius was completely suppressed and could no longer counterattack. Just think, there was still someone like that left in Elmheim. and in Viscount Highfried's family, no less. Ash's anger intensified the magical surges, and now, powerful, threatening streams of magic blazed around Darius. Hayfried, who was watching the fight, nervously clenched his fist and quietly said that this was very bad. Darius clenched his teeth in fear, his face twisted in horror and covered in large beads of sweat. And before Ash's mind's eye, there appeared a picture of Darius laughing and cutting off his hand, which was bound by a magical chain. The bastard laughed as the wounded Ash writhed in pain, staining the snow with his blood. The young man's face darkened with anger. He really wanted to crush this vile nit. Roderick's son muttered for Aster to stop and not kill him. Viscount Highfried shouted loudly to his pupil not to do this. The young man looked back. Aster smashed both of Darius's jugs into pieces, but he still did not kill the Duke's heir himself. The huge hall where the festival was taking place fell silent. Many understood that the consequences of such a duel would not be long in coming. The Viscount's adopted son harnessed the magic, and everyone saw the fragments of Darius's swords, as well as Darius himself wet from fear. Aster said contemptuously to his cousin, "Next time, to avoid the fear of getting wet, come wrapped in old rags." The young man looked with contempt at the arrogant son of the Duke, who had wet himself, whom he had once feared so much. He sheathed his sword and thought that he was no longer the wingless Ash. Alfina was ready to scream with delight when she saw the results of this fight. The mere knowledge that he was no longer the wingless Ash cleared the clouds in his mind, and the young man decided that was enough for today. Suddenly, the young man felt the presence of a pressing, aggressive aura. He turned towards the side where the most pressure was felt. At the top of the stairs stood the angry father of the defeated and humiliated Darius. Ash immediately recognized him. It was the same man who in his past life had deprived him of his power by tearing 7 wings from his body. It was Duke Roderick Elmheim, burning with anger for his son. Everyone present froze in fear. But the young man did not take his eyes off his main enemy, Roderick. He finally showed up. Aster's expression suddenly changed dramatically. The Duke could not believe that the youngest child of the Viscount's family had actually crushed the heir of the main branch. But now things have gotten even worse. After Roderick's pride was trampled like that, he definitely won't keep quiet. The 8th head of the main branch of the Elmheim house walked menacingly towards the boy who dared to disgrace his son so. Seeing his father, Darius was very happy. Now his offender would be severely punished. The massive figure of Duke Roderick Elmheim loomed menacingly over the 10-year-old boy. He silently studied the impudent man who dared to publicly disgrace his promising son and heir. But the Viscount's adopted son did not look away, and looked at the Duke with undisguised hatred. Beaten and shamefully wet, Darius rose from the arena and hurried to his father. He shouted at the Duke that this impudent adopted son had dared to humiliate him, the heir to the ducal house, in such a way. Darius shouted that this freak went against the main branch, although he was just an adopted child. The Duke's heir asked his father to use his power to crush and punish the Viscount's ward. But instead, Roderick pierced his own son's hand with his sword. Darius was horrified. He looked at his bloody hand. His father hit him right in the place where the coat of arms of wings was located. The Duke's son screamed in pain. The spectators were stunned by such cruelty. Would Roderick really punish his own son? Grion looked at the arena in horror, wondering if his father would really cut off Darius's hand. Roderick growled, "How dare you smirk? You have dragged our family's name into the dirt." A dumbfounded Darius crawled away from his father and pulled up his shattered and bloody hand. Highfried shouted at Roderick to stop, as they were only children. But the Duke swung his sword and cried out, "He who cannot even stand up for himself has no right to hold a sword." Everyone froze. Many had heard of Roderick's unprecedented cruelty, but clearly no one expected this from him. Frightened Darius tried to crawl away from his angry father and save his hand with the coat of arms. Roderick's eyes flashed with anger. But then a 10-year-old boy stood in the path of his sword. The Duke asked what the boy was doing, who allowed him to come between him and his worthless son. Aster explained that his cousin had not yet apologized to his sister Alfina, although he had promised to do so in case of loss. The young man persistently asked his uncle if he could postpone the punishment until later. Roderick told the boy he heard Highfried took him in as an orphan. Did he really think that made him a true Elmheim? Aster replied, "He is the son of a Viscount. Let's leave blood ties. What about knightly pride? The burden of inheritance, his father taught him that. The Duke glanced sideways at Hyfried and said, "Then, as a member of the Viscount's family, the boy had needlessly offended the main branch. The sword of the king, the pinnacle of 12,000 knights under the banner of Elmheim. This is pride. What's happening is no longer just a childish quarrel. The Viscount's son should understand this." Silence fell over the huge hall. Everyone was perplexed as to whether the Duke would really kill his brother's adopted son. One thing was clear. This sword dance festival would definitely become the subject of much discussion and gossip. Roderick reminded the boy that his adoptive father had once paid with his hand for his infidelity. The Duke slightly cut the boy's collar and angrily asked him how he would pay for the humiliation. But Aster did not flinch. He replied, "With all due respect, uncle, this was not a brotherly squabble, but an official duel." The young man explained to the Duke that he had responded to the insults against the Viscount's family with his sword. Roderick looked in surprise at the impudent boy who was calmly talking to him. The Grand Duke himself, Aster reminded his uncle. He himself said that anyone who cannot stand up for himself has no right to hold a sword. He will not give up a single finger. The festival organizer whistled. What unheard of insolence! And Alfina clenched her fists convulsively. One of the observers cheerfully remarked that the boy was only 10 years old, but he was behaving like this. He was probably joking. The Duke frowned. He had nothing to answer the boy. He was silent for a while. Then Roderick removed the sword from Aster's shoulder and noticed that he understood him perfectly. Taking a few steps back, the Duke demanded that his adopted nephew take a fighting stance. Aster immediately drew his sword and looked questioningly at the Duke, wondering if he was really going to fight with a child. Roderick Elmheim was considered one of the strongest knights, and the young man prepared to defend himself from his attack. The guy was not mistaken. The Duke dealt the boy a crushing blow, directing a stream of his magical power at him. Tears welled up in Alfina's eyes, and she covered her mouth with her hands to keep from screaming in horror across the room. Viscount Hyfried shouted at his brother, asking what he was doing since Aster was still just a child. Hyfried drew his sword and rushed towards the Duke, who was attacking his 10-year-old adopted son. Roderick raised his sword, crossing it with his older brother Hyfried, but the Viscount did a somersault and flew over the menacing figure of the angry Duke of Elmheim. Hyfried rushed to his adopted son, asking Aster if the boy was okay. Part of the hall was destroyed by Roderick's blow. Smoke and dust swirled around and stones were scattered. But the Viscount was struck by a completely different picture. He saw his pupil. The boy stood, clutching a broken sword in his hand. His face was bloody, his suit was torn, but he was ready to continue fighting. A silent rage burned in the boy's eyes, and he did not take his burning gaze off the enemy. Roderick also saw the boy and noticed the fire in his eyes. He said nothing more. The Duke turned sharply and quickly headed towards the exit of the hall, taking with him Darius, who was trembling with horror. While Roderick and his son were leaving, Hyfried tried to calm the belligerent Aster. The Duke was incredibly angry. He practically flew up the stairs, with the ashamed and frightened Darisu timidly trailing behind him. When the Duke and his son were almost out, Aster suddenly staggered. But he had received serious wounds. The Viscount picked up his son and looked at the wounded boy with concern. Aster told Dad that he protected Darius, because he made a promise and everything else. Hyfried confirmed that he saw and heard everything. Aster was simply magnificent. The Duke climbed up to the top platform, where the festival organizers and the main judges of the event stood. One of them told Roderick that it was childish to swing a sword at a kid, but allowing the boy to run wild would have been to ruin the reputation of the main branch. Wasn't that a worthy compromise? To stand up to Duke Roderick and survive? That guy is definitely a rising star. Everyone was sure that this was the best debut for the guy. Although some were horrified, it seemed that Roderick would cut Aster in half right there. Roderick countered, "No, a time of upheaval was coming. A storm strong enough to split the world in 2 or 3. Meanwhile, Alfina rushed as fast as she could to her wounded little brother, who had stood up for her. Aster soon fully recovered from the injuries he received during the sword dance festival. The Viscount's young knights were shocked as they watched the young master's constant training. No one could stand against the very young Aster. Wooden training swords either flew out of his hands or broke. The Hyfried Knight's trainer, who was beaten by a 10-year-old boy, told young Master Aster that his strength was impressive. Looking at the young man, the knight said that he had very serious skills. It was scary to think that he was only 10 years old. After returning from the sword dance festival, Aster began training with even more zeal than before. One of the knights asked if Aster had not crushed Duke Roderick's third son. The Knights of Highfried have had to endure abuse from the main line for a long time. So this is excellent news. At the sword dance festival, Aster fully demonstrated his strength and presence. This should silence those who called the Viscount's family the Elmheim stain. But the young man's main target remained Duke Elmheim and his sons. Ash, now called Aster, was too greedy and wanted to see how far his skills would go. He wanted to test himself harder, but he understood perfectly well that in his current state, he would not be able to defeat Duke Roderick. In the end, the crest is just an indicator of the hidden mana rank. Innate mana is a useless treasure if you can't control it. But Aster still couldn't fully draw out the power of the 7 wings. The boy thought, if only he could experience the power of the 7 wings to his heart's content without worrying about going mad. While thinking like this, Aster continued to swing the wooden sword on the training field. Another knight was knocked down by the young gentleman, unable to withstand Aster's onslaught. The young man looked at his fallen opponent with regret. The fallen fighter's wooden training sword fell to the pavement with a crash. The young man shouted who was next. Was there anyone else? But all the knights were already exhausted. None of them rose. Suddenly, he heard his sister's voice behind him. Alfina asked Aster if he was showing off again. The girl was wearing a tracksuit. She noticed that her brother, as usual, was going too far, and said that his father was calling him. Hearing that his father wanted to see him, Aster said that he would go immediately. As he was leaving, the young man noticed that this outfit on Alfina was a great rarity. The girl looked questioningly at her younger brother, asking what he was talking about. Aster asked if Alfina hadn't said she didn't want to wear that costume because it didn't look cute. The sister explained that balance is important in everything, and looking at Aster, she realized that she too could not remain the same. She suddenly put her training sword to his face, and the young man recoiled in surprise. And Alfina added that when Aster returns, he will keep her company for a while. The boy laughed cheerfully and asked his sister to go easy on him, since she was a talented swordswoman. He raised his hands, showing that he surrendered and acknowledged the unconditional victory of his pretty sister. Entering the house, Aster quickly went up to the Viscount's office and knocked on the door. The young man carefully opened the massive door, looked into the office and apologized, asking his father if he had called him. Viscount Highfried nodded his head affirmatively and invited the boy to sit down. The surprised young man silently sat down in a chair at the large table in his father's office. Hayfried said it had been 10 years since they had welcomed Aster into their family. To be honest, the Viscount thought about waiting until the young man grew up a little more. The Viscount placed a ring with a scarlet stone in front of the stunned young man. The boy asked his father what it was. Hayfried explained to the guy that this was proof of the status of the next head of the house. Aster's father told him that he wanted him to inherit the title of head of their house, and the young man was stunned by such an unexpected honor. The Viscount reminded the boy that Aster knew perfectly well that their family was in a delicate situation. However, they are still a side branch bearing the high-sounding name of Elmheim, and they cannot leave the heir's seat empty forever. As a lord in charge of the territory, Highfried has much to protect. Aster asked his father if his sisters agreed with the decision of the head of the house. The Viscount replied that the sisters would be returning from the Knight Academy in 3 days, and he intended to speak formally with everyone. The oldest in the family were Sister Malfa and Sister Kudo, both of whom were already studying at the academy. Aster noted that if that was the case, both of them would not be hurt by it. Sister Kudo in particular would definitely be furious. She hates Aster simply because he was born a man, and just so happened to be blessed with 7 wings. The young man rose from his chair and told his father that he could not accept this. Aster added that he can't even control his own mana. He's an inexperienced fool who almost killed his sister. Standing before the father who saved and raised him, Aster said he didn't have the confidence in his strength to convince his sisters. The Viscount looked silently at his amazing pupil, who crawled to the threshold of their house. As the young man headed for the door, Highfried told him that he had long doubted that Aster was really a child. The head of the family smiled. He had planned this ring as a reward for the sword dance festival. He took out a large case and spoke. But it seemed that this would please the guy much more. The guy's eyes sparkled. It seemed like this was a powerful family weapon. He had heard about it in his past life. The Viscount explained that this case contained the demonic sword Graham. He can control the power of the 7 wings. It is a magic-devouring sword. Having chosen a large clearing in the forest, Hayfried decided that this place should be suitable for training. Aster asked his father if he just wanted to show off the sword. Wouldn't the training hall be fine? The Viscount replied, no, it was just a precaution. Besides, the guy often destroys the house. This demonic sword Graham is a famous blade that is inherited from generation to generation only by the eldest son of the Elmheim house. Hayfried ordered it to be delivered to Aster from the vault of the main house. The Viscount began to unwind the blade with his teeth. The young man looked in surprise at the famous weapon, or rather, at the strange fragment, and asked if it was a sword. The Viscount understood what the guy was talking about, and explained that, as Aster saw it, this sword had no blade. However, if magical power is poured into it, as Hayfried showed, a powerful blade immediately appears. It is a sword of possibilities that becomes complete through the magical power of its owner. Hayfried directed the blow of the demonic sword into the depths of the forest, showing the stunned Aster its power. The impact created a huge clearing and rut in the thicket. The power of the weapon was terrifying. The Viscount added, however, with weak magical power, there is a danger that the sword will absorb all your mana. Besides, this sword has a complicated history. Hayfried asked his son if he wanted to try it. Aster carefully took the renowned family sword from his father's hands. He pointed the blade slightly upward and thought, well, I need to pour my magical power into this sword. Suddenly, the sword burst into flames. The young man saw a blinding flash. The weapon suddenly literally came to life. Aster saw the flaming blade appear and felt the magical power flowing into it. The Viscount's knights, who were continuing their training, were surprised to see an incredibly bright and powerful stream of light. They asked each other what that light was, whether a comet had fallen or something. The other one objected, "Don't talk nonsense. Something had flown into the sky." The boys didn't understand what it meant that something could fly into the sky from the neighboring forest. Alfina noted with a sigh that it must be Aster. There was no one else here. The young man looked at the weapon with admiration and muttered that this sword was simply monstrous. The Viscount looked at the sky in surprise, where young Aster had just pointed his weapon. Hayfried thoughtfully told Aster that what was truly monstrous was his strength. The bearer of the 7 wings crest has never been born in the entire history of the Elmheim generations. If Aster were to master this power, he would become a swordsman far stronger than those with 6 wings, such as Hayfried and Roderick. The young man mentally swore that he would definitely surpass Duke Roderick. The Viscount added, however, that excessive force inevitably sparks conflict. If it becomes known that Aster has 7 wings, the young man will have a lot more problems. Everyone will be desperately jealous of him, and some will want to use him for their own selfish purposes, and some will simply try to eliminate you as a hindrance. There will be plenty of those too. Hayfried extended his strong hand to the boy, trying to show that he would always support him. The Viscount said, therefore, in order not to regret your own powerlessness when the time comes, become strong while you can, Aster. The young man took his father's hand. That was right. He would no longer drag out a miserable existence as in his past life. Aster thanked his father very much and promised that he would definitely master both the 7 wings and this sword. 3 days later, the parents and younger sisters met the older girls who had returned from the Knight Academy. Kudo exclaimed that they had returned. And why wasn't the curly one running to greet them? The girl portrayed a very strict older sister who returned to scold the younger ones. The next second she exclaimed, "Now, dear sisters, give your beloved older sister a big hug in honor of our reunion." But all the younger girls rushed to hug their sister Malfa, shouting to her that they were back. Kudo was offended. But what about hugs with her? Why is everyone ignoring their beloved sister Kudo? The younger ones answered because Kudo's sister immediately tousled their hair. The girl objected. There was no such thing. She, having perfectly mastered chivalry, would not do anything so unworthy. Kudo glanced sideways at her younger sister Alfina, who was standing modestly to the side. She suddenly rushed towards her and hugged her, asking if Alfina had been a good girl. An indignant Alfina exclaimed, "Stop clinging already. trying to break free from Kudo's tenacious hands. Suddenly, Malfa looked around the room in bewilderment and asked where Aster was, why he hadn't come to meet them. The Viscount replied that if we are talking about that child, then he is training intensively. Kudo immediately stopped smiling. For some time now, she had been very wary of Aster. Meanwhile, the young man was in the forest and trying to master the demonic sword Gram. He poured mana into it again and again. But the sword seemed to have a life of its own and did not want to obey the guy. Aster clenched his teeth, sweat pouring down his face from the strain. He muttered. Nothing was coming out. Even if he can create a sword from magical power, he can hardly just restrain it. The young man struck the forest thicket with his sword, scattering everything around, and he thought bitterly how he could be like his father. Suddenly, he heard Kudo's voice behind him. The girl noticed, "Wow, what a mess! You're showing off again." Aster turned to Kudi's sister and asked in surprise if she had returned already. The girl smiled. Just think, he didn't even come to meet his older sister. Isn't that too cold? Or, since Aster is special, the sisters are not in his sight. She heard about the sword dance festival. Father must be very proud. Aster replied that he had also heard that his sister had participated in many missions and had distinguished herself despite being only a trainee. The boy knew that Kudo was the only knight to receive the honorary knight medal this year. The girl noted that if she couldn't do at least this, she wouldn't be able to become her father's successor. She heard that Aster had given up on talk of inheritance. Had he really decided to take care of her, Kudo? Aster mentally asked his father why he told her about this, God. Why create so many problems? He replied to Kudo that he had no such intention. He simply thought that he did not have the qualifications for it yet. The girl went to her younger brother, saying, "Oh my God, both father and Aster are so angry," because they know perfectly well about her dream. The student of the Knight Academy took out her sword and approached a thick, spreading tree. Aster looked questioningly at his sister, trying to understand what she was going to do. The girl swung her sword at the thick tree trunk with all her might. She shattered the mighty trunk into pieces and sent the lush crown straight towards her younger brother with a blow of her sword. The young man quickly jumped back. If he hadn't done so, the tree could have crushed him. He asked Kudo what she was doing. Was she crazy? The girl said that her older sister would check on him for the first time in a long time. Kudo warned her brother with a smile that she would hit him for real from now on. The boy asked his sister to stop. This demonic sword was not yet complete. Kudo asked him if he could come up with the same excuse to the enemy on the battlefield. Aster chuckled. With the enemy, you say? Well, okay. Sister said that a knight's mindset is to always be on the battlefield. If Aster holds back, she might even crush him. The guy looked at his sister and thought, she must be joking. He can barely control his magical power, and she's about to seriously attack him. It's just crazy. But he must accept this fight and give it his all. If he doesn't do this, his elder sister will definitely kill him as a potential heir. The brother and sister entered the battle, tearing apart the forest. The girl admired. Aster's sword skills were more refined than ever. Just think. He was able to keep up with her abilities even after she honed her skills at the Knight Academy. However, she could not understand what this pathetic imitation of a sword was. The girl remarked dismissively that Aster had no control over magic whatsoever. The older sister attacked Aster furiously, not allowing him to come to his senses. He shouted that Sister Kudo was still as ruthless and rude as ever. The young man remembered that she had been like this since her earliest childhood. Perhaps this is because Aster is the only boy in the Viscount's house who has the right to inherit. Or maybe it's because Aster is special and has a wing crest that surpasses anyone else in the family. Kudo was like a living storm, challenging Aster to a duel for any reason and calling the world unfair. To put it bluntly, Kudo is Aster's natural enemy. He noticed that his older sister had rushed at him with renewed vigor, her magic blazing. Brother and sister crossed blades, but Aster was too afraid to harm Viscount Highfried's daughter, Kudo shouted, as she thought. Aster was not fit to be the next head of this house. Malfa was very worried and asked her father if it was really wise to leave them alone. The girl feared that at this rate, this quarrel between brother and sister could lead to casualties. The Viscount countered that they were good rivals in their own way. They might be a little reckless, but it wouldn't come to that. The eldest sister replied sadly that she very much hoped so. Malfa asked her father why he had withdrawn them from the Knight Academy. It wasn't just to discuss the inheritance. Hayfried confirmed that everything was correct. He opened the drawer of his desk and took out an envelope from there. The girl was stunned. Couldn't she be mistaken? This was... Father nodded his head affirmatively. Yes, this was a call from the main house of Elmheim. It seems that the elders who lead the main house want to see the face of their grandson. Malfa thought. This was certainly a very serious turn of events. The Viscount answered seriously. That's right. In the worst case, they could lose their Aster. Meanwhile, Kudo and Aster continued their desperate battle in the forest. The boy shouted at his sister not to talk nonsense. He had already refused to discuss the inheritance. The old man heard this. Kudo, striking, replied, "Father says that Aster's refusal in itself is unacceptable to him." The girl dealt a powerful blow to the young man, who blocked it with a demonic sword. Aster thought Kudo was heavy, as if he was fighting a troll swinging a giant hammer. The older sister's eyes sparkled with anger. At that moment, she hated this talented foster child with all her soul. The young man clutched the demonic sword in his hands. He tried only to defend himself, but not to attack his older sister. And Kudo dealt blow after blow. Aster dodged and tried to reason with the angry girl. He swung his sword and cried out, "Enough! Maybe she will finally listen to what he has to say to her." Kudo chuckled. Aster just tried to escape from here, didn't he? She dealt her foster brother a crushing blow, throwing him back and wounding him. Blood gushed from Aster's mouth. He thought about how terrifying the brute force was. Kudo stated that Asta is a third-rate warrior if she can only swing a sword. If he only has magic, then he is a second-rate warrior. Only by mastering both the sword and magic can a young man become a first-class fighter. She is disappointed in Asta. The difference in the wing crests means the difference in the amount of mana a person can control. They say that a difference of just one wing is approximately a threefold difference in strength. In other words, in terms of magical power, Kudo with 5 wings should be 2 stages weaker than Asta. Yet he avoided a direct clash of forces and fled to his beloved sword swinging. Does the guy really distrust his own strength that much? Or he might be afraid of falling into madness again, as he did 3 years ago. The boy asked himself in surprise if he was really afraid of the power of the 7 wings. He never even thought about it. Could it be that he was unconsciously limiting his own strength? Maybe the reason this blade is unstable is because Asta was trying to forcefully suppress his magic. The girl's face was dark with rage. She told Aster that he had everything she ever wanted. She sincerely wished for her younger brother's death now. Kudo shouted, if he was so stupid as to let this rot without realizing how lucky he was, then he should give it all to her. Aster gripped his sword. He wasn't going to let anyone rob him like they did in his past life. To his older sister's surprise, he released his magic and sent the angry Kudo flying backwards. She was amazed that the guy had blocked her blow with full force, without fear of hurting his little sister. Aster thanked his sister with a smile. Thanks to her, his eyes were finally opened. Kudo was becoming more and more surprised. Aster was rushing into attack without even materializing the blade. The girl clenched her teeth. Was she really out of mana? There was no way she would let her brother win this fight. Aster realized that it was she, the unprecedented, inexhaustible magic hidden in the 7 wings. There was no way he could have her completely right now, if only for a moment. He told himself to forget about maintaining the shape of the blade and concentrate all his magic at the moment of impact. Kudo smiled, which meant that Aster had come up with something after all, even though he was a complete idiot. The guy said he had no intention of wasting this second life he had managed to grab onto. He knew for sure that he would never give up this power or this sword to anyone for anything. And he certainly won't give up his family, because that's something he couldn't achieve before, no matter how hard he tried. Kudo was surprised at what kind of second life he was talking about. Maybe he was going crazy with power. Aster rushed to attack his older sister, warning her, therefore, that there would be no give-in, just as she wanted. The boy swung the flaming demonic sword, intending to strike Kudo. Suddenly, Aster's sister felt that something was wrong with her sword. Her formidable sword suddenly disappeared right from her hands, something that had never happened before. And the formidable Aster, surrounded by powerful magic, was inexorably approaching her. The girl's eyes widened in horror. Was she really going to die in the forest of her own home? She saw her younger brother's face, dark with anger, with burning eyes, his sword hanging menacingly above her. Kudo opened her eyes and looked around in surprise. She was lying in her bed. The girl asked in confusion where she was. Was she really in her room in the estate? The eldest sister said with a smile that Kudo had finally woken up. Sister Malfa opened the curtains, letting sunlight into the room, and she noticed that Kudo was in no hurry to wake up. Kudo jumped up and asked what was going on with the duel. What happened to her fight against Aster? Malfa smiled and said that Aster himself brought her home. He said that Kudo fell asleep right in the middle of the duel. He decided that the fatigue from the journey had taken its toll. At least, that's what he told everyone in the house. Kudo muttered that this couldn't be. She looked at her sword, which was standing next to the bed. At the last moment, she was absolutely sure that Aster had cut her down. But in reality, he must have dispelled the mana blade a split second before it struck. What Kudo felt was only a residual trace of mana that passed through her body. And if you think about it, Aster would never kill his own sister. But at that very moment, Kudo truly believed that Aster would kill her. The girl smiled, even though he is much smaller than her. He really is a naughty little brother. Kudo took up her sword and asked Sister Malfa where that little rascal Aster was now. The girl exclaimed that she would not accept such an outcome of the duel. This time, she would give it her all from the very beginning. Malfa replied that Aster was no longer here. Kudo looked at her sister in surprise. How could it not be? Where did that naughty boy go? Malfa reported that he had received a summons from the main house. He had left quite recently with his father. Didn't Kudo know about this? The girl froze in horror. She understood perfectly well how dangerous this trip was. Kudo screamed. What is Malfa saying? Why didn't they tell her? She hadn't even heard anything about it. Meanwhile, Viscount Hyfried's carriage rolled towards the main estate of the Elmheim clan. The Viscount explained to Aster that the people they would meet were the elders who supported House Elmheim from the shadows. These are the former heads of the main and side branches, as well as influential figures of the entire Elmheim house. Although they have retired, they still wield enormous power. They are shadow rulers. Hyfried sighed. These elders hadn't shown the slightest interest in Aster since the Viscount adopted him. So why did they call Aster now, the guy said. Probably because of what happened at the Sword Dance Festival. Aster had heard that the Elmheim elders valued family prestige more than gold or even their own lives. And those who tarnish this prestige are thrown into a cage to be fed to monstrous beasts. Hyfried wondered where Aster had heard such terrible stories. The guy smiled, just a little here and there. Well, he was already ready for punishment, or at least for exile. The Viscount frowned. Was Aster really sure that it was possible to leave without even saying goodbye? The young man reassured his father that everything was fine. He was planning to leave anyway as soon as the sisters arrived. Besides, Kudo is probably glad that he won't be under her feet. She will be able to relax. And yet, thanks to his sister Kudo, Aster finally began to master the demonic sword Graham. Aster felt that he could draw out the power of the 7 wings, so no matter what happened to him, he asked his father not to try to help him. The young man assured his father that he was ready to survive on his own. But the Viscount frowned. He didn't like all of this. Suddenly, the travelers heard a cry. What does it mean to be on your own? You are the youngest in the family, so don't act like you're incomprehensible. The Viscount and Aster turned towards the voice. The young man could not believe his eyes. Where did she come from? Aster asked Kudo's sister in surprise why she was here. Did she run all the way? The girl jumped into the carriage and said that it was so cruel to leave without saying a word to her own sister. She heard everything. Aster was summoned by the great elders of the main house. Even she and her sister Malfoy had never been invited there. The Viscount remarked that he was sure Kudo understood that he could not take her with them to the main house. The girl replied that she knew this, because her father had called her and Malfoy home to look after everything while he was away. She understood that. But this call means that Aster is in a situation that requires extreme caution. Even Malfa's sister said that Aster might never return home. He smiled. Kudo was exaggerating. They were going there to talk. Although whether he would be able to return safely after that was a question. Kudo demanded that Aster listen to her. Everyone knows that she can't stand him. He is a boy. He has 7 wings. He is always treated specially. He is stronger than her, even though she is the older sister. He also acts like an adult, even though he is the younger brother, and Kudo can't stand all of this. But still, Aster is part of her precious family. The Viscount listens silently to the rather strange but still heartfelt conversation of his dear children. And Kudo continued that no matter how strong Asta was and how mature he acted, he was still her little brother. So he must definitely come back so they can fight with swords again. Opening the carriage door, Kudo said as a parting word that she would not let him get away with such a victory. Having said all this, the girl jumped out of the carriage at full speed, considering her mission accomplished. Aster looked at her with surprise. And why did she come all this way? The Viscount smiled. She is a good rival, right? The young man smiled and mentally thanked his sister, promising that he would definitely return. Kudo stood on the road and waved her hand after the departing carriage. She was very worried about her father and brother. The gates of the main house of Elmheim swung open, and the commander of the knights bowed and said, "Welcome back, Lord Highfried." The commander of the guard informed the Viscount that the Great Elder was already waiting for them inside. The Viscount said there was no need to escort them. The knight objected, and was strictly ordered to escort them both inside personally. As the young man thought, they didn't call him to babysit their grandson. At least the atmosphere was completely different. But still, the guy was even glad to return here, because this house was very familiar to him. These tall, austere towers brought back memories for Ash. He hadn't been here for a long time. The Viscount was sure that Aster already understood this, but today he especially must not lose his composure, no matter what they told him. The guy replied that it would depend on how they behaved. Hayfried explained that this is why he tells his son that the problem is with them. He tried to explain to the boy that those they were about to meet were very powerful people. Aster was surprised. Strangely, Darius was nowhere to be seen, although, since his arm had been crushed, it would be difficult to return to duty so soon. The Viscount called out to Aster, asking if he was listening to him. The boy winced and replied, "Yes, of course." He immediately promised his father that today he would be as quiet as a mouse. After all, his sister warned Aster to return safe and sound. The heavy doors of the Elmheim Elders' Assembly Hall swung open. The commander of the knights reported to the Great Elder that Lord Highfried and his son had arrived. The old man laughed. They finally showed up. It's been more than 10 years, hasn't it? The Great Elder asked how his grandson Hayfried was doing. The Viscount dropped to one knee and respectfully replied, "Long time no see, Sixth Head. Or rather, great-grandfather." Highfried and Aster bowed their heads respectfully before the secret ruler of House Elmheim. Aster thought, so this is the monster lurking in the shadows of Elmheim. In his past life, the boy had heard a lot about this old man, the sixth head of the family, Zenas A. Elmheim. And the rest, apparently, are heavyweights under the wing of the main house of Elmheim. Aster recognized several faces. He had seen them at the Sword Dance Festival. But Roderick doesn't seem to be here, which is strange since he is the current head of the house. The Great Elder, noticing Aster's gaze, explained to the boy that Roderick was not here. He is the leader of the knights who report directly to the royal family and has no time for such trifles. In his past life, Ash never even got to see Zenas, so he didn't care. But to gather so many influential people without the presence of the current head, Zenas still seems to have enormous influence. Hayfried asked his grandfather what exactly he called trifles. The old man chuckled. But hadn't Hayfried figured it out himself yet? Zenas heard that the Viscount's pet had caused quite a commotion at the Sword Dance Festival. Aster realized, as he had expected, that this was exactly what was being discussed. Hayfried said that regarding this matter, the current head Roderick should have already settled this issue personally. The old man noted that it was nothing more than a show for the public. But that did not change the fact that the name of Elmheim was tarnished. Taking in an unknown child as an adopted son was a mistake. They would have turned a blind eye if he had remained harmless. But since he has bared his fangs at the main family, there is no choice but to exile him. And Hayfried will not escape punishment either. Aster jumped up and shouted for the elder to stop. It was all his doing. His father had nothing to do with it. Viscount Hayfried frowned silently, showing that Aster had acted very unwisely just now. The boy looked closely at his father. He saw that the Viscount was very unhappy. The elder noticed that the boy seemed to still lack education, since he was trying to get involved in an adult conversation. The Great Elder stood up and said that there were 12,000 knights under their banners. They bear the burden of the Elmheim name on their shoulders. But the knights are far from monolithic. There are countless numbers watching from the shadows, waiting for their chance to seize the top. Naturally, this also applies to those in this room. The elders just want peace of mind. They need proof that Viscount Highfried will not harm House Elmheim. The old man handed Hayfried a sword. He reminded his great-grandson when he failed to protect his master and trampled the name of Elmheim into the dirt. Right here in this hall, Highfried allowed Roderick to cut off his hand. This time, Hayfried must also prove his loyalty by cutting off this boy's head. If the Viscount does this here and now, the matter will be completely closed. Hayfried bowed to his grandfather and replied that he refused to do so. He would rather take his own life than raise a sword against his own child. Aster whispered in surprise at what his father was doing. The old man said, "I see. Well, that was expected. In that case, they would take action themselves." The great elder tapped his stick on the stone floor. Zenas told his grandson that he could die. His wife, daughters, and this boy, all to the last one, would be executed. The knights drew their swords, and the 6th chapter concluded that from today on, the Viscount's house would cease to exist. Dozens of sharp swords reached out to Highfried and Aster, ready to cut down the unarmed people. Suddenly Aster asked, "What are you so afraid of, great-grandfather?" The old man looked angrily at the boy, who added that the grown men were huddled together and trembling. It looked pathetic. If an elder is so afraid of being bitten by his own dog, they can cast him out or kill him as they please. But if they were going to touch his family, they should think twice. To the surprise of those present, Aster began to undress. Hayfried was horrified. He realized what the young man was going to do to save the family that had become like family to him. The boy mentally asked his father to forgive him for the fact that he would apparently have to disobey his wise advice. The knights were stunned when they looked at the young man's bare back. It was, "This coat of arms is on his back, which means the boy has the power of 7 wings. How is that possible?" Aster warned the great elder that if they touched his family, the 7 wings would become enemies of Elmheim. Therefore, they had better think carefully before making a final decision. The elders in the hall began to make noise. "This is impossible. Could this really be the emblem of the 7 wings?" Someone asked, "This coat of arms can't be fake, right? It would take hundreds of years for something like this to appear on a human body. But this mark is definitely real." The great elders slowly approached Aster. Zenas asked the boy if he understood what he was showing them here now. Aster replied, "Of course he understands. He heard that the more wings, the more surprised people are." One of the elders, hearing this answer, laughed loudly. Everyone turned to the merry fellow, and he asked to be excused and suggested continuing. Zenas said, "Let's start with the fact that the coat of arms is an organ that produces magical energy given to people by spirits in ancient times. By passing this power from parent to child, from generation to generation, people further honed its potency. But until now, no one has reached the level of the 7 wings except for the Spirit Clan, who were the progenitors of the crests." Aster was surprised. That's how the elder was hinting that he was a member of this Spirit Clan. The great elder confirmed that if his 7 wings were real, then it was possible. Hayfried looked at the boy in silence. He understood that now everything had become much more complicated. The guy said that he was the son of a viscount, and now he was not at all concerned about the circumstances of his birth. All he wants to know right now is whether the elders are ready to see him as an enemy or not. Even if Aster is banished from Elmheim, there will be many houses that will fight for the right to accept the owner of 7 wings. For Elmheim, who are already afraid of rebellion, this will be a huge threat, and they should be motivated to keep him close. The symbol of the 7 wings, the one who surpasses even the Grand Duke Roderick. The elders were confused and silent. As old man Zenas said, "Even Elmheim is not united. An uprising is coming, a large-scale civil war that will engulf the country." Ash had already seen this future, so that he and the Viscount's house could survive it. The guy wanted to determine who was his friend and who was his enemy. The 6th head of the Elmheim house chuckled. Did the boy really believe that he was worth that much? After all, there is no evidence that these 7 wings are real. The young man smiled and suggested to the old man that if he didn't believe him, then go ahead and let them try to kill him. But if they do, it will mean war between him and all members of House Elmheim. Aster understood that if Elmheim took the matter seriously, it would not be difficult for them to kill someone like him. So what would they do? Suddenly applause rang out in the silent hall. Someone clapped their hands cheerfully, and everyone turned towards the sound. The council member who was clapping his hands remarked that it seemed like this conversation was just going around in circles. He asked the great elder how about giving the boy a test right there. Another elder asked Count Mice what he was doing, and the count replied, "Well, surely everyone wants to see the power of the 7 wings." Maze smiled. After trying to decide the fate of this boy, it will not be too late. He asked what the elders would say, since they were now in the estate of the world's greatest fighting clan. The count was sure there would be a couple of suitable tests here. Aster thought, "Count Maze, there is no doubt. This man can become an ally." The great elder agreed, saying, "Very well," and ordered Aster to follow him. The old man grumbled. In the end, it was a grandfather's duty to punish a grandson who couldn't keep his mouth shut. The guy asked if this was the testing site. It was quite dark here. Zenas explained that behind this darkness there was an underground bunker connected to the drains. It used to serve as a refuge. But now the old man keeps a magical beast there. The essence of the test is simply to defeat this beast. Hayfried told his son what a troublesome boy you are. And this, after he was told to keep quiet about the 7 wings. Aster smiled and told his father that he couldn't hide something so noticeable forever. This was a good opportunity. The Viscount asked the young man not to lose his vigilance and try to pass the test with dignity and survive. The boy promised his father, took the demonic sword Graham, and shouted loudly that he was coming. The young man looked around carefully. Count Maze watched with a smile as the daring youth so boldly stood up to the most formidable Zenas Elmheim. Aster sank to the very bottom. Water splashed under his feet. And it really was dark here, but still not so much that the guy couldn't see anything at all. Suddenly, he stopped, asking in surprise what was under his feet. The old man above remembered. Oh yes, he gave his great-grandson a chance to also regain his honor. But Darius did nothing but moan until the very end. It was unbearable to watch, and then a beast appeared ahead, which the terrifying 6th head of the Elmheim house had planted here. The old man shouted from above to Aster so that the boy would not disappoint him like cousin Darius. The monster, seeing the man, rushed at him with a loud roar. And so the test began. So the rumors about the Elmheims keeping magical beasts in their estate were true. Only this time, Ash even felt sorry for Darius, because he was born in a house full of monsters. But Ash himself had no intention of dying in this dark and damp basement in the teeth of his cruel grandfather's toothy toy. The boy clutched the demonic sword in his hands, preparing to destroy this monster. Aster poured mana into the demonic sword and instantly cut the monster's huge body in half. Then, to be sure, he chopped the gutter dweller into several pieces. The members of the Elmheim House Council of Elders gasped in unison at how quickly a 10-year-old boy had dispatched the monster. Aster noticed that, as for him, his older sister was much more terrible than this magical beast. But then he heard strange sounds behind him. He turned around and saw that the animal he had just killed was coming to life. The young man couldn't believe his eyes. The old man had placed here more than just a magical beast. This giant monster turns out to be undead. The vile monster opened its mouth again and growled menacingly, now with dead tentacles protruding from its entire body. Viscount Hayfried screamed, "This is undead! Why does such a creature live in the basement of the estate?" The old man explained that this thing was attracted by the smell of death. Apparently, it decided that there was plenty of carrion here, so it crawled into the basement. Since she wouldn't die no matter how much you cut and burn her, Zenas ordered her to be captured, deciding that she was the ideal opponent to test her strength. And plus, thanks to this monster, they no longer have problems getting rid of corpses. One of the elders noted that catching the undead is not an easy task even for an experienced knight. And at the same time, Zenas told the boy to kill the creature. Was he just going to watch as the child with 7 wings died? The old man replied that if that happened, it meant he was nothing more than a braggart. The crest of a wing without power was worth less than an ornament. Zenas was sure that even if the boy died, they would be able to deal with the consequences. And it would even be more convenient for them. Count Maze listened silently to the great elder's creaky laughter. It seemed the boy had really frightened the old man. Maze turned to the young man again, and he was making such a loud statement that it would be a shame to lose him. He mentally told Aster, "Look, don't die so easily. Survive in spite of all your enemies." The guy realized that no matter how many blows he threw, He didn't feel any recoil at all. Moreover, the monster's regeneration is simply phenomenal compared to ordinary undead. Besides, the undead are already dead, so killing them in normal ways is useless. To finish her off completely, she must either be burned by sunlight or purified with a weapon imbued with holiness. If you can't do either, don't engage in combat. It's standard protocol and common sense when facing the undead, but Aster has no escape route if he uses only conventional methods. There is no point in him having 7 wings. The guy gritted his teeth and decided that he would prove his worth at all costs. He will show these elders that he can crush common undead with brute force. There was a loud explosion and part of the drain wall collapsed. The council member muttered in fear. What kind of incredible magical power is this? So this is what it is. The power of 7 wings. The elders asked each other what had happened, whether the boy had really defeated her. Zenas chuckled in confusion. Nothing could be seen in the clouds of smoke. Only a 10-year-old boy stood there, clutching a demonic blade in his hands. The old man exclaimed, "What a pity. He was such a good animal." But suddenly the enraged monster's huge paw knocked Aster off his feet and threw him to the floor. The guy clenched his teeth in pain as the monster's claws dug into his arm. The undead, changing before his eyes, bared its teeth at the young man, and the monster's vile tentacles wriggled right above him. Viscount Highfried pressed himself against the bars and called his son's name in horror. Count Maze told Lord Highfried not to do anything unwise, like try to save the boy. Hayfried asked angrily if Maze was telling him to just stand there and watch him die. But the Count, with a smile, advised the Viscount to calm down. Nothing was over yet. He invited Hayfried to take a look. It seemed the boy still had a trump card hidden away. And indeed, Aster smiled. He told the monster he was very glad that it seemed to be working as it should. The monster's body was engulfed in flames, and the boy noticed that the undead had become noticeably thinner than before. Aster directed the demonic blade's magical whirlwind straight at the monster, holding it in its paw. The monster stopped roaring. He felt himself getting weaker with each new stream of fire. Suddenly, dark blood gushed from the monster's mouth. But despite this, the young man continued to attack. He told the undead that in that case they would continue in the same spirit until the creature died. The magical flow grew stronger and stronger. It punched a hole in the monster and scattered parts of the beast like a whirlwind. Hayfried remembered that he had seen this once before. But then it was only his first clumsy attempt. It was then in the forest that he first showed Asta how to use the famous blade Graham. But now it is something else. Something completely different. It is already a conscious attack with controlled force. The members of the Elder Council shouted that this place was about to collapse. Cracks ran across the floor. Everything cracked. And the great elders stood at the edge of the well and watched the boy without stopping. The old man said in surprise, "Oh, so this is what it is. The power of 7 wings." Everything around was ablaze with powerful streams of magic, and Aster continued to attack his enemy until he died. One of the elders asked in fear if everything had really gone quiet and what had happened. He rushed to the edge of the well and asked where the magical beast had gone. Zenas realized that the boy had caught the relentless undead in a whirlwind of magical power and crushed it into powder. It was a display of brute force of the purest quality and quantity. Primal magic that could not even be called technique. The old man was perplexed as to whether this was really the work of the 7 wings. The 6th chapter, Elmheim, asked the young man if he had done something like this before. Highfried replied that it was unlikely. Even he never ceases to be amazed at how quickly his son is growing. Count Maze asked the great elder, "Well, did the boy pass the test?" The old man chuckled. He doubted that anyone here would object. Maze shouted to Aster that he had passed the test. The Count suggested that the young man go up quickly. Otherwise, it would probably not be very comfortable in the drain. Aster replied that the chains he had used to descend were tangled in all this chaos. Perhaps someone could throw him a rope. The old man asked Aster if he was sure about this. If he missed this chance, there would never be a second one. The young man replied that he was not interested in the struggle for inheritance in the main branch of the family. Besides, if he stays in the estate, his cousins will not be able to sleep peacefully. His place is still in the Viscount's house, Zenas asked, and the guy calls this modesty. He can't hide the ambition that burns in his eyes. The sixth head was sure that the boy intended to go against Elmheim sooner or later. It looks like he wants Roderick's head. Aster looked at the wise old man in surprise. He chuckled. Aster might not be so wary. Zenas had no intention of asking him about his motives right now. The young man asked, "But why? Aren't the rebels their enemies?" The great elder reminded us. He already said, they are far from being one whole, and this Roderick is too stubborn. And if Aster's existence serves as a deterrent, then so be it. But if the boy bares his teeth at him, Zenas, even once more, then he certainly understands what will happen. As he left the sixth chapter's office, Aster thought, what a monster this old man from Elmheim is. Seeing Aster leave Zenas, Highfried asked him what the old man had told him. The guy replied that the old man wanted to accept him into the main branch of the family. But Aster refused. The Viscount was stunned. How could that be? Count Mays said it was a pity. The boy would have been treated much better if he had been officially under the guardianship of the main family. The young man asked, "You are Count Mays, if my memory serves me right. Why did you offer to help?" Mays winked at Aster with a smile and replied that he had no idea what the guy was talking about. The smiling Count laughed. He just wanted to make fun of the impudent boy. But more importantly, from today on, Aster has truly become a master of the seven wings, both in word and in deed. He suggested that the guy look around carefully and strain his ears. Aster heard that he needed to get this power. He needed to get rid of the boy. After all, he was a child. There were ways to use him. As Aster himself said, the seven wings crest has enormous weight. And from now on, the number of those who target it will only increase. The young man turned to Count Mice and asked if this meant that the Count was one of them. Mays didn't expect such a question. His handsome face stretched in surprise, but he quickly pulled himself together. The Count replied that he was actually the director of a knightly academy, and finding promising young men was part of his job. He pointed to the fat man with the mustache and said that the old man over there was the same. So Count Mays is looking forward to Aster's admission to their school. Waving his hand, he said, "See you later." The young man exhaled. What a slippery guy. It was too early to decide whether he was Mays's ally or not. The Viscount placed his hand on his son's shoulder and said that he would have to tell him in detail about his triumph. He asked the guy, "Well, let's go home." And he happily agreed. Aster laughed. "Mom will faint when she sees all those wounds on him." The knight reported to the commander that young Master Darius had died during a test arranged by Lord Zenas the other day. Roderick replied, "I see. He heard that Highfried's child was also summoned by the elders of the main family. How did everything go with him?" The knight was surprised. It felt like he had missed everything about his son. He said that there was good news, too. After listening to the report, Roderick said thoughtfully, "I see. So the seven wings had really awakened within him." The knight gasped. Did the commander really know about this? He believed that under such circumstances, the balance of power within Elmheim, which had been maintained for so long, could collapse. The knight remarked that they should probably take some action, but Duke Roderick ordered that everything be left as it was. If the balance could be shaken by an obstacle of this level, Elmheim would have fallen long ago. Besides, the Duke believed that there was no need to rush. The seven wings would sooner or later become his. In the meantime, let him play freely for a little while longer. Roderick will be delighted to see how long the baby he let escape that day can struggle. The Duke's eyes flashed angrily as he turned to little Ash, the child of seven wings. 4 years passed, and applicants who came to the entrance exams to the Knightly Academy were registered. The employee urged the young people to hurry up. The exam would start soon. One of the guys patted his friend on the shoulder, asking if this was really the one about whom there were all sorts of rumors. The other one doubted it. Come on, he heard that guy was much tougher than this one. A receipt was placed in front of Aster, stating that the state and the knights are not responsible for injuries during the exam. He must sign it. After this, the young man must present his wing emblem. They cannot let in those who do not have magical powers. The document was signed. Okay, now the wing's coat of arms. And then the academy employee saw the name Aster F. Elmheim. He looked questioningly at the slender young man. So he was that very Elmheim. The guy smiled. He had to show his wing emblem, but it was in a place that wasn't so easy to show. Aster asked if his face wasn't enough to get him accepted into the Dorasil Night Academy. In the huge courtyard of the Knightly Academy, many young men gathered, eager to get in to study there. Aster was walking calmly among the broad-shouldered guys when he heard someone trying to call out to him. Some guy told Aster that he was talking to him. To the one who was standing there with such an important air, it was Bigger Smythe. He said that he had never seen that face before. Apparently, he was some kind of country gentleman who had made a mistake in the door. The guy said that the elite of the elite among knights gather here. This is the place where the exam for candidates for the Royal Knights is held, Aster replied. Then, no problem. Smythe barked at the boy to stop. Everyone here has gone through grueling training, and yet they come back to take this exam again and again. Smythe asked, "What did that kid do? He showed up here waving that childish sword. There was no place for such a greenhorn swordsman here." Bigger Smythe added that if the kid just came to have a look, then he should get out of here. One of the guys noticed that he was at it again. Smythe had taken up hazing the newbies again, and he didn't get tired of it every year. But what's more important is, isn't the guy Smythe is hitting on the same Elmheim everyone's been talking about? This is the same Aster, the owner of 7 Wings. Suddenly, Ash heard a familiar voice. Oh my, who is this? Could it really be Cousin Aster? The guy frowned as a smiling Grion walked towards him. Duke Roderick's son said cheerfully that they had not seen their cousin for a long time. Grion heard that no one even knew where Aster was born, so he took it upon himself to call him his cousin. Aster expressed regret about his cousin Darius. Grion replied that Aster shouldn't worry about it. Such a worthless person deserved death. On the contrary, he felt relieved that he was gone. Just because Darius was a year older, he was always acting like God knows what, and he was also a hindrance to Grion. Grion didn't know anything about the 7 Wings or anything else, but Aster was better off not underestimating those who belonged to the main branch, because now there is no one left here who could protect Aster. The examiner muttered, 2 from the Elmheim family at once. The candidates in this stream were unlucky. The guys knew that the main and secondary branches were still at odds with each other, and no one wanted to be caught between 2 fires. Bigger Smythe immediately changed the tone in which he had spoken to Aster. He obsequiously asked Aster if he was really one of the Elmheims. The young man laughed affably. He extended his hand to the guy and suggested that they call him simply Aster. The first exam began, and the examiner thanked everyone for their bravery and patriotism. Royal Knights are different from those who run amok in the wilderness. They serve the king and protect the king. They are honorable blades who risk their lives for the king, and they have no use for dull or useless swords. The boys must consider this exam as a battlefield and show their true worth to the fullest. Ash knew what the examiner was saying was complete nonsense, but he was finally back here. When he was wingless, he was not even given the right to stand here, beyond this line of the world of the strong, which he could never reach. And the man who still rules at its pinnacle is the commander-in-chief of the Royal Knights, Roderick A. Elmheim. The boy mentally told Roderick to just wait there. He would catch up with him in a moment. But to do that, he must first get past this qualifying exam. The examiner suggested starting immediately and gave the signal to shoot. Heavy arrows were thrown at the candidates. This was the first test. The guys struck by arrows began to fall around as if they had been mown down. The first exam is a turret test. The winner will be the one who stays on his feet until the very end. The candidates rushed around the area, shouting in confusion about what they should do with this. Someone shouted for everyone to run. If they stayed here, they would all be killed. Another shouted to the knights to gather in groups and cover each other's backs, deflecting arrows. The examiner noted that, as expected, those who have experience from previous attempts know what to do. But even then, the survival rate is only about 30%. Such superficial measures soon reach their limits. What the examiners wanted to see was genuine military skill. This is the incredible power that only the owner of the wing emblem can achieve. One of the guys shouted, looking at Aster, "Why is this idiot just standing there? Is he frozen in fear?" Grion grinned. Let him die like that, turning into a hedgehog. But Aster calmly drew the demonic sword Graham from its sheath to create a defense. Having filled the weapon with mana, the boy created a magical vortex that easily cut through arrows. The other academy candidates hiccuped in surprise at what that was. No one could believe that this guy had really blocked all the arrows. And Viscount Highfried's son, smiling, suggested aiming at him with all his might. The examiners, who had seen a lot, looked at the boy with wide eyes. A magical whirlwind of enormous power attracted and broke powerful arrows. One of the candidates asked, "Hey, what kind of monster is he? Not a single arrow can reach him." The rest simply hid under Aster's magical currents and thus survived. The examiner smiled. This guy is manipulating the released mana to create an upward flow. What incredible mana control. It's like he's caught in a storm. The other candidates asked each other if it was really over. Thanks to Aster's technique, more candidates survived than the examiner expected. So what? The examiner said, "Excellent restraint, gentlemen. Look at the corpses around you. Those candidates who are still standing have passed the first test. There is no time to rest. So the examiner will lead them to the next test location." Bigger Smythes grumbled, "Yeah, what an instructor from the underworld." And this was after they had endured a shower of arrows. Aster asked with a smile, "Are you tired, old man?" Smythes was amazed that Aster looked so completely unperturbed. The instructor was amazed when he looked at Aster. He didn't show any signs of fatigue after releasing so much mana. He was eager to see how Aster, the owner of 7 wings, would fight further. Gloomy Grion walked with the others to the place where the second exam was taking place. He remembered his mother's instruction that Grion must prevent Aster from becoming a royal knight at any cost. This had to be done for the future of their Elmheim. To ensure fairness in the next test, everyone will use the same swords, and everyone must hand in theirs. The guys grumbled. "Why is this such a hassle?" Aster asked. "But it used to be different." Smythes noted that the swords they, the knights of the middle rank, carried were still almost no different from these. It's just a guess, but they were most likely wary because of Aster's strange sword. The boy looked suspiciously at the weak sword given to him. Grion remarked sarcastically, as one would expect from his cousin. It seemed he had already tamed a hanger-on. He turned to Bigger, Grion asked. If he remembered correctly, this is the heir of the house of Baron Smythe, right? Grion whispered that such a third-rate nobleman would receive a painful lesson if he wagged his tail at just anyone. Smythe immediately muttered, "Wait, Mr. Grion, this is a mistake. He has nothing to do with this guy at all." Aster smiled bitterly. "Yeah, the atmosphere here is so-so. Most of the young aristocrats slavishly fawned over Roderick's son." The examiner turned to the gentleman and said he would now explain the rules of the second test, which would be a siege battle. All candidates will be divided into 3 teams and will fight for control of each other's camps in the forest. The camp is considered captured when the team's flag is raised on the flagpole. Any action that makes flags unusable, such as defacing or confiscating them, is prohibited. But there are no other restrictions. The examiner then announced the composition of the teams in which the candidates would take the test. The team with the red flag included Grion A. Elmheim. On the yellow flag team, the strongest fighter was the eldest son of the Nolan family, famous for their fencing skills. And on the team with the blue flag was Aster and several frightened nobles. Aster saw a smoke signal, a sign that the second entrance test had begun. Each camp has 3 flags. To win, you need to capture at least 2 camps, including your own. Smythes asked Aster if that meant only one team would advance. The boy confirmed and asked what was bothering him. Another explained that this meant that they would have to fight Elmheim. And this, Aster himself understood, was very dangerous. Aster looked at his teammates in bewilderment. Bigger Smythe asked him if he didn't get it. They were all just terrified of Elmheim's possible revenge. After all, their opponent is the young master of the main family of Elmheim. Even if it is a test, how can they raise a sword against him? If they raise their sword against Grion, they will probably never again be able to proudly call themselves knights. In the worst case, all their families and servants could be killed. And this is quite possible. No one wants to make an enemy of this family. Aster asked if they were giving up the challenge. Smythes replied there was always next time. Bigger added sheepishly that Aster would most likely not understand what they, the weaklings, were feeling. Aster rushed to the other camp alone. Just think, he was isolated during a team fight. But there is a point to this. Aster has already forgotten. But for the knights, Elmheim is exactly like this. This is a family of tyrants that cannot be resisted. And Grion, the symbol of this reign of terror. He remembered Bigger Smythe's words about Aster not being able to understand them. On the other hand, Aster is ultimately also one of the Elmheims. Running up to the enemy camp, Aster was surprised. It was somehow too quiet. Had no one really entered the battle yet? Perhaps the opponents are simply being cautious. Or there is something else going on. Nolan, seeing Aster, said, "Oh, who would have thought that you would actually come here alone?" The swordsman assumed that this meant that everything was going exactly as he had predicted up to this point. Aster looked at Nolan in surprise. Who was he? Who was he even talking about? And why did Nolan take down his own camp flag? What happened here? And where is everyone else? Nolan threw a yellow flag, saying just in time he had some free time, and he would be Aster's opponent. The young man looked at the lone inhabitant of this camp in bewilderment, at a loss to guess where all the others had gone. Aster looked up and was surprised to see a red flag fluttering on the flagpole. He looked at the proud Nolan again and mentally asked the guy what all this meant. Meanwhile, the knights from the yellow camp and from the yellow one walked towards the camp with the blue flag. Grion led the squad, quietly promising to show his cousin how real members of the Elmheim family fight. So, the second stage of the selection exam for the Royal Knights, called the Siege Battle, was underway. 20 participants are divided into 3 teams, and the team that captures 2 or more territories by the end of the exam wins. In other words, planting your team's flag on the enemy base is an absolute requirement for passing the exam. Aster asked Nolan if he hadn't been on the yellow team when the examiner announced the teams. So why did he raise the red flag at his base without even fighting the enemy? Nolan replied with a smile. It's simple. They made an alliance with Grion Elmheim. Christopher, the eldest son of the Nolan family, renowned as the founders of courtly swordsmanship, his crest is 5 wings. The instructor knew that during the first exam, Nolan found himself in the shadow of the 7 wings and did not really stand out. However, there were only 2 people who passed the first test without even changing their faces: Aster and Christopher Nolan. The examiner was sure that both of them were brilliant uncut diamonds among knights. It was a pity that they could not both pass. Aster sarcastically asked his opponent what alliance he was talking about, and he simply gave up his position. He himself understands that even if this is the case, only one team can win. Nolan answered that's exactly it. So he decided to let the main family win. Now everyone is on their way to Aster's base with Elmheim. The guy realized that things were bad. Smythes and the rest of his guys were now in danger. Aster asked Christopher if Grion had apparently threatened him, reminding him of what happened to those who went against Elmheim. Nolan explained, knowing that they would simply be crushed. No one would deliberately stand in the way of the carriage. The knightly nobility is built on a strict hierarchy, and any aristocrat understands this perfectly well. Christopher added that there was nothing special about it. It was just natural behavior expected of an aristocrat. Suddenly, Aster felt his blade breaking. He realized that there was clearly something wrong with this sword. The guy was puzzled as to whether the examiner had really slipped him a defective piece of iron. Nolan said that Aster could rest assured that it would be a fair one-on-one duel. He never liked the Elmheim family. The swordsman especially doesn't like upstarts like Aster. Christopher lunged, and at that moment, Aster's sword broke in half. The guy took a sharp piece of debris to distract the enemy. He threw a sword shard at Christopher Nolan. The swordsman knocked away the splinter and grunted in surprise. He was very surprised that his opponent's sword suddenly crumbled. Meanwhile, Aster was gone. Nolan shouted, "What? Are you trying to run away? Stop!" Aster shouted as he ran that he would deal with Nolan later. But first, he needed to settle scores with someone else. Nolan chuckled. Did he really scare this upstart that much? Aster is a real disgrace to all knights. Then, his attention was drawn to a fragment of the sword that Aster threw at him. Christopher picked up the fragment and was surprised at what kind of sword it was. Even for a cheap fake, the quality was simply 0. The guy realized that this was Elmheim's doing. He wanted his enemy to be unarmed. What a disappointment. Aster ran into his base and loudly asked Smythe if he was okay. Grion noticed that his cousin had arrived earlier than he had expected, and judging by his appearance, Nolan had not even been able to detain him. Roderick's son sarcastically reminded him that Aster had said so confidently that he alone would be enough, that everyone even believed him. Grion asked his cousin how things were going on his property. They had just captured third base and established complete control. Aster shouted at Grion to stop making faces. He must answer now what he did to the members of Aster's team. Grion frowned. He didn't like such open disrespect at all. At that moment, Aster felt a sword touch his back. Grion grinned. It was his cousin asking about these. Bigger Smythes came up behind Aster and jabbed him in the back with his sword, saying, "No offense intended." Smythe loudly declared that he had said from the start that he was not going to play along with the idiot who had challenged Elmheim. Grion grinned. They didn't even try to resist. Even the village monkeys had enough brains to understand whose side to take. Aster asked his cousin if he really thought he could beat him just by outnumbering him. Roderick's son laughed. No, you're wrong, cousin. We've already won. The victory condition for this battle is to hold 2 or more territories by the time the exam is completed. Aster, of course, may now desperately rush to plant his flags at every base. But Grion reminded his cousin that he simply didn't have the people to protect those flags. It's enough to wait until Aster goes to another base and simply raise the red flag again. At the end, Grion's team will have 2 or more bases and win. Aster menacingly promised that in that case, he would simply make it so that they would not be able to do even that, by killing every single one of them. Grion's eyes flashed angrily. He understood that this was a serious argument. Everyone present fell silent in fear. They had already seen Aster's power during the first exam. Grion said with a smile that Aster was bluffing, because his sword had become useless, hadn't it? Roderick's son added that it didn't matter whether Aster had 7 wings or not. Without a weapon, he was as good as wingless. He asked his cousin sarcastically if he wanted to try fighting everyone here with his bare hands. Aster replied that it was indeed a problem. Grion impressed him with his foresight. The young man pulled out of its sheath a fragment of a sword that had been given to him on the instructions of the young master of Elmheim. Smythes looked in surprise at the fragment of the sword that Aster took out and showed to everyone. The boy threw down the useless fragment and told his cousin that he had thought of everything better than he expected. Grion's eyes gleamed. He was sure that he had already defeated Aster. The fragment of the sword of the hated son of Viscount Highfried fell to the ground with a clang. Aster lowered his head slightly, calculating each of his movements to the second. The broken sword and feigned confusion were meant to calm and relax Grion and all his supporters. Suddenly he crouched down and tripped the unsuspecting Bigger Smythes. The village nobleman, having received a couple of blows, dropped his sword from his hands in surprise. This is what Aster was trying to achieve. The sword knocked out of Smythe's hands flew up. As soon as the weapon began to descend again, the sword instantly appeared in Aster's hand. The boy filled the weapon with mana and swung it around himself, scattering those who stood next to him with swords at the ready. Grion, standing on the fortress wall, was taken aback by what nonsense was happening. Aster turned to his cousin and told him that showing himself in front of him had been his big mistake. The guy warned that Grion had opened up too much and would now inevitably lose. Roderick's son swore, exclaiming that Aster was a real monster. Viscount Highfried's protege released mana and instantly rose above the level of the fortress wall. Now he could calmly attack the bastard Grion, who had set up such a vile trap. The Duke's heir shouted in confusion that it was impossible to fly so high, that it was some kind of trick. Aster flew up and told his cousin that he was drawing his sword too slowly. He struck Grion's weapon, breaking it into pieces. Roderick's son gasped in confusion. He was scared. Ash remembered very well the day he first accidentally flew. Since he was wingless in his past life, he feels this feeling of power when mana is manipulated. He advanced on his opponent, causing him to stagger and fall down from the high fortress wall. Grabbing Grion by the chest, the guy said, "It's great to have wings. Look at that wall that was once so high." The Duke's frightened heir muttered for his cousin to stop it. Aster swung his sword at Grion and threw him off the high fortress wall. He told him that now that once high wall seemed so low. A deafening explosion was heard outside the fortress as both opponents landed in the forest. Everyone was on alert. Thick clouds of smoke and dust were rising from the crash site. Smythes grumbled, "Well, the manner of the fight. What happened to those guys?" Another candidate suggested that everyone look at the entrance. Bigger Smythe was stunned. How could this be possible? What would happen to them all now? Aster appeared in the clouds of dust, dragging an exhausted and badly beaten Grion by the scruff of his neck. Aster's gaze was unwavering. He clearly didn't regret what he had just done at all. Duke Roderick's son hung like a sack in his cousin's hand, his suit torn, his body covered in abrasions and bruises. Entering the fortress, Aster threw Grion to the ground. The Duke's heir groaned quietly. Seeing the others, Grion muttered in a weak voice, "You idiots! Why are you just standing there and watching? The future Duke demanded that the knights kill Aster alive. This is Elmheim's order. The candidates for royal knights stood in indecision, unsure of what to do. Smythe, cursing, rushed towards the sword that someone had thrown down. Aster asked the boys if they were really that afraid of Elmheim's revenge. Bigger replied, "Of course they are afraid. His Smythe family is just a third-rate noble house that can be blown away by any wind. If Elmheim wanted, they would be crushed like ants so that weaklings like them could survive in this world. And they would have to behave submissively. It all looks pathetic. And for someone like Aster, who has everything, their behavior must be incomprehensible." Aster couldn't find what to say right away. He felt sorry for these boys who had been intimidated since childhood, but suddenly a smile appeared on his face. Bigger Smythes asked the young man irritably what he was laughing at. What could be funny about it? Aster explained that his sister had once told him something similar. She had said that he could not understand the feelings of those who had nothing. He has his arguments against it, but it is indeed a fact that he is now blessed with power, and that is why there are things that only he can do. Aster brought the sword to Grion's throat. He growled in fear. Aster stated that his enemy was Elmheim, and if they couldn't do anything about it, then he would change everything. This current arrogant and despotic Duke of Elmheim, Aster promised to destroy him. Everyone was so frightened by what they heard that they were ready to run away as if they had said it. Grion asked his cousin in a barely audible voice what he was saying. He would pay for this with his life. Bigger Smythe asked Aster if he understood what he was saying, because it meant. The young man answered calmly, "Of course, he understands perfectly well that this is a declaration of war. No matter how much the knights fawn over the current Elmheim, at the end of this devotion, only betrayal and a miserable end awaits them. If they do not want such an inglorious end, then they must fight." Aster was sure that these 7 wings that he carried on his back were certainly given to him for this very purpose. So they too must choose which Elmheim they will follow. The current Duke or him, Aster. Grion shouted at his cousin not to fool everyone. This simply could not be allowed. He told the boys that he remembered all their faces and names. Just let them try to betray him. Roderick's son reminded everyone that they knew very well what would happen to them then. Bigger Smythe's face trembled with suppressed emotion, and large beads of sweat ran down it. The guy suddenly screamed, unable to contain it any longer. He cursed and threw his sword to the ground, showing that he refused to obey Grion. He quickly made his way towards the team's torn blue flag, asking Aster if he was really going to topple it for them. If Aster gave them hope, and in the end nothing changed, he, Bigger, would hate him with a passion. Aster answered Bigger seriously that he promised to overthrow Duke Roderick A. Elmheim. The guy stood there silently for a while, clutching their team's flag in his hands. Finally, he made up his mind and went out to the center of the fortress, raised the flag over his head and waved it. He shouted that the eldest son of the Smythe family, Bigger Smythe, was on Aster F. Elmheim's side. Others were perplexed. It couldn't be. He really said that. But that meant Grion's plan had failed. Roderick's son muttered angrily through his teeth, "Oh, you country bumpkin. You'll regret this bitterly." Bigger asked the others why they were all just standing there watching. This was their chance to show the Elmheim upstarts what they were capable of. Smythes proposed to the knights present to bet everything on 7 wings. The boys looked at each other in confusion. They really wanted to do it, but their fear of Elmheim was great. Aster thought, -1. At least now he wouldn't have to plant the flags alone. But that's still not enough. He needs more allies if he's going to overthrow Elmheim. Aster removed the sword from his cousin's neck, and Roderick's beaten son rose slightly, sitting on the ground. One of his team members asked Grion if he was okay, but the Duke's enraged son hit the boy, shouting for the useless trash not to touch him. Grion was furious. This scum had decided to overthrow Duke Elmheim. If Grion lets Aster continue to do whatever he wants, he won't be able to look the main family in the eye. He remembered Darius's torn body and decided that he was not like his brother. Grion clenched his fist convulsively. He knew that he couldn't let it all end here. Suddenly, he heard a mocking voice behind him, asking what was wrong. Elmheim. Turning around, he saw Nolan, who was saying that for someone he hadn't seen for a long time, Grion looked rather pathetic. Grion yelled at Nolan for not carrying out the task given to him. The Duke's son asked what Nolan had been doing all this time, Dealing with Aster was his task. Roderick's son was pleased. It was the perfect option. Nolan was still on his side. His crest may not be comparable to the Seven Wings, but when it comes to sword fighting, he is definitely stronger than all the others. Grion shouted at Christopher to tear Aster to shreds quickly. Instead of answering, Christopher Nolan threw the red flag on Grion's head. The boy told young Master Elmheim that he had come to return it. As Christopher suspected, Grion's methods were at odds with his code of honor. In other words, Nolan breaks their alliance. He and Grion are no longer allies. The guys are confused. You're kidding me. Even the Nolan family is betraying them. Now it's not clear whose side to be on. Christopher turned to Aster, saying it seemed like they were back to square one. After all, Aster didn't think that he would pass this exam without getting even with him. Nolan. The Nolan family's proud swordsmanship against Asta's Seven Wings. The boy turned around and saw that Christopher was ready to cross his sword with him. But there was no time for that. Nolan was determined. Aster was trying to figure out what to do. The fight could drag on. Then he would definitely lose. Nolan lunged and offered to finally find out which of them was stronger. Aster easily blocked Christopher's attack and countered. No, that would have to wait for now. The guy quickly counterattacked Nolan with a very unusual blow. Christopher was very surprised. He immediately realized that this guy had somehow become completely different, not the same as before. Aster slashed his sword across Nolan's blade, shattering it to end the fight. Nolan didn't understand what Aster was talking about. How to postpone? Did he forget? Only one team can pass this exam. Christopher jumped back from the enemy who had just destroyed his blade. He shouted to Aster that if they both wanted to become royal knights, they had to decide everything here and now. Aster replied that this would be a problem for him. The young man told Nolan that he wanted him to become a royal knight too. Christopher Nolan stared at Aster in surprise, wondering what he was saying. Aster noted with a smile that Nolan had incited everyone to overthrow Elmheim, so it would be rude to ask him to give up his dream. He stated that he had a plan to make sure that everyone got through here, despite the fact that they were on different teams. Nolan looked questioningly at his opponent, wondering what he was talking about. Grion frowned. He was at a loss to guess what this Viscount's adopted son had come up with again. Bigger asked Aster in confusion. He must be joking. It was simply impossible for everyone to pass. Aster said that he, of course, cannot guarantee it, but he is still confident of success. But for everything to work out, Aster will need the help of each of the candidates. So first, we need to resolve the issue with our cousin. Grion's face lengthened. Was he really going to kill him? But Aster extended his hand to him and said, "Let's make peace, Grion." The examiner was surprised to see that all three multicolored flags were hanging tied together on all the flagpoles. He indignantly asked what all this meant. Did they not even know how to raise a flag? Aster explained that the victory condition was capturing 2 or more camps, but they were not told that only one team could raise the flag at a camp. They decided to form an alliance between the 3 teams and jointly occupy all the camps. The instructor growled at the guy. Did he want them all to pass? He apparently decided to make fun of the exam. Bigger was worried. He knew it wouldn't work, Grion confirmed. Of course not. Such twisted logic wouldn't work. The instructor asked Aster if he were ordered to attack and destroy enemy territory, he would simply shake the enemy's hand. Aster replied that if this enemy was more valuable alive than dead, then yes, he would have done so. The examiner stated that a knight is the sword of the state, and it is not for Aster to make such judgments. The young man asked the examiner if, in that case, he was apparently going to disqualify them all. But since they haven't broken any rules, wouldn't such a decision be an act of ego that goes beyond their authority? The examiner thought for a moment. The arguments of Viscount Highfried's son seemed quite compelling to him. Aster came up and whispered to him. Besides, if everything failed this way, then Grion wouldn't do the same either. I wonder if the main family will keep quiet about this. The examiner glanced sideways at the gloomy and battered Grion A. Elmheim. The examiner thought even more seriously. No one wanted to quarrel with the great and terrible Duke Roderick Elmheim. Bigger Smythes noticed nervously. And so the great examiner went off to consult with his superiors, and they have been sitting in waiting mode for a whole hour. Bigger asked Aster if everything will really be okay with them. The guy was worried that they would all really fail. Aster answered evasively. Who knows? At the very least, They showed the Academy's leadership that this was worth discussing. Grion sat surrounded by his followers and frowned, realizing that he had lost completely. Bigger quietly said that he was very surprised that this rich man Grion agreed to cooperate, what Aster told him. The young man smiled cheerfully. "Oh, nothing special, really." And then the doors opened and the chief examiner asked everyone present for attention. All the candidates immediately turned towards the doors. Some even jumped up from their seats in excitement. The instructors said that Director Mimir would now announce the results of the exam. Everyone should listen carefully. The boys turned to the director and froze in anticipation of what the Academy's leaders had decided. The instructor once again called everyone to order and silence. Now they would hear everything firsthand. Bigger Smythes asked in surprise. "That's the director of the Night Academy." The guy was amazed. "This Mimir looks like an ordinary old man," Aster hissed at him, demanding to show at least a drop of respect. Mimir approached the young man and noticed that he must be Aster, because thanks to him, they were faced with a truly difficult choice. Accepting so many candidates at once is unprecedented. There were proposals to re-examine, but with the support of the other directors, they decided to accept the students' demands. Aster cautiously asked the director what this meant. Mimir looked closely at the persistent and promising young man with 7 wings. The director of the Academy smiled broadly and happily announced that everyone had passed. The hall exploded with joyful cries. Everyone was happy except Grion, who didn't fully believe that Aster's gamble would work. Christopher Nolan smiled reservedly. He was also happy. And just like Grion, he didn't fully believe that everything would work out. The director wished the children to continue to work hard and prove to them that their decision was not a mistake. Mimir clapped his hands and congratulated everyone on their enrollment. Welcome to the Dorasil Night Academy. That same evening, the newly admitted students enjoyed their stay at the Nightly Academy. Bigger laughed merrily. It was just incredible. The food was delicious and the baths were just huge. Smythes reminded the others that all of this was made possible by Aster. The guys shouted at him that they would follow the boss for the rest of their lives. Many of the minor nobles couldn't believe that Aster actually helped them all get through. Nolan chuckled. What a bunch of opportunists. Even though they were Grion's lackeys not long ago, he wasn't going to thank Aster. Bigger remarked that these were too big words for someone who had lost to Aster. Nolan objected. He simply agreed to a draw. Aster said it didn't matter. They had challenged the Elmheims, and yet, here they were, official students of the Academy. Eventually, all these small victories will add up to a huge wave that will crush Elmheim. The young man exclaimed enthusiastically that this was where their rebellion began. Aster's 2 older sisters have already graduated, but Alfina is still here studying. Since she entered a year earlier, she should know how everything works here, and will certainly be on Aster's side. Their training at the Night Academy begins tomorrow. But first, they need to get used to life here. Aster came out of the bathhouse and suddenly felt that something was wrong here. Some kind of suspicious silence. He turned around and was surprised to see that the first years had also come out of the bathhouse and were kneeling. The guy was horrified at what they were doing, and they muttered, "This is the living owner of 7 wings, an excellent talisman for good luck. Who knows? Maybe they too will receive divine blessings if they pray for him." They folded their hands in prayer and asked that their prayers be heard. Aster was beside himself. But that doesn't happen. Christopher Nolan sighed heavily as he watched this whole mess. The swordsman noticed that he was looking forward to the future with dread. Meanwhile, Grion was in the office of his mother, one of the directors of the Academy. She said that her son had disappointed her. Instead of dragging this 7-winged child to the bottom, Grion completely lost and crawled back. Helen Elmheim frowned. She heard Grion even let Aster say that he was going to crush Elmheim. Does the son really want to say that he just stood and watched after such an insult? Grion begged his mother to forgive him. He would definitely correct this mistake. He promised to live up to her expectations next time. But at that moment, he received a punch to the face, and blood gushed from his mouth from the blow. Lillian A. Elmheim, Grion's older sister, exclaimed that there would be no next time for such a piece of trash. She kicked her brother away and declared that such a useless brat would be better minced and fed to magical beasts. The girls said contemptuously that Grion was the same worthless loser as Darius. The beaten Grion begged his mother and sister to spare him, but Lillian continued to beat her brother, kicking him again and again. Grion looked at his sister's approaching merciless feet and cursed mentally. He suffered painful blows and thought, "Damn it. It's all because of him. It's all because of that freak." In the fortress, Aster extended his hand to Grion and offered to cooperate. It would be worse for him if he returned empty-handed. Grion asked what his cousin was talking about, and he explained that if word reached the Great Elder about what had happened here, if Zenas finds out that Grion was framed by some trash from the side branch and failed the exam, he will definitely kill him. Grion's face darkened with horror. He understood perfectly well that Aster was right. This was exactly how his brother Darius died. Aster whispered to Grion that he had seen Darius's last moments, and it had been a terrifying sight. And the young man briefly told Grion what had happened in the basement of the Great Elder of the main family. Aster was sure that a person shouldn't die like that, because Grion didn't want to end up like that, right? All that is required of Grion is to keep quiet and turn a blind eye to what Aster is about to do. The girl heard her older brother shout, "Enough, Lily, leave him alone." Can't she see her sweet little brother crying and apologizing, can she? Julius A. Elmheim appeared in the mother's office and said with a smile that they were a family connected by the same blood, and the family must get along. Alfina will confirm this. He ruffled the hair of Aster's sister, who was muzzled. Alfina remained obediently silent, and only her convulsively clenched fists betrayed her excitement. Helen Elmheim said that the image of the Elmheims' absolute dominance, which had held the knights back until now, was crumbling. This image began to waver with the appearance of the owner of 7 wings, this adopted son of Viscount Highfried. Duke Roderick's wife told the children that this is why the two of them must remind the knights that they are not here just for show. Lillian was delighted. Her mother had officially given them permission to torment these impudent newcomers. Julius broke into a satisfied smile as he heard his mother's order to show everyone what real violence was. The next day, first-year students at the Knight Academy began practical classes. The teacher told them that they had all been chosen as cadets for the glorious Royal Knights. However, the Royal Knights are an elite force in combat, strategy, and any other area, superior to other knights. Of course, those cadets who wish to join the ranks of the Royal Knights must also be special. All first-year students had to cut down a strong pole to show their level of strength. The Dorasil Knight Academy divides all trainees into 6 ranks based on strength level. The Academy's directors designate the curriculum based on the abilities of students of different ranks. In other words, the more capable the children are, the more opportunities they have to learn advanced techniques. Those who have neither strength nor ability, even after entering the Knight Academy, will not last long here. If a student can only swing a sword, then he is 3rd class. If a cadet has mastered magic, then he belongs to the 2nd class. Only by mastering both the sword and magic can one become a 1st-class master. There is nothing to teach ordinary fools. If the guys want to learn better techniques, they must become stronger. Constantly proving one's strength is the only freedom granted to the students of the Knight Academy. As if in response to the teacher's words, Aster concentrated his magical power and delivered a powerful blow. Everyone was stunned when they saw that Aster had knocked down a pillar with one blow, which some could only scratch with their swords. The young man stood calmly near the destroyed pillar while the others whispered admiringly. The teacher, looking at the pole, exclaimed, "Excellent!" and suggested that the others try to reach this level first. The guys unanimously replied that there was no way they could do that. Director Mimir and the chief examiner watched the testing of the newcomers' strength closely from the balcony. The examiner was amazed. So these are the legendary 7 wings. What an incredible talent! It was so easy to handle a golem-quality magic pillar, Mimir agreed. Yes, the boy was certainly special, but the hidden potential of the 7 wings goes far beyond this. It needs to be developed. If Aster is satisfied with who he is now, he will end up being eaten by the dragons lurking in this academy. Hundreds of talented knights have already fallen victim to them, and the directors are unable to resist this tyranny. Bigger Smites was genuinely indignant at the ranks at the Knightly Academy. They finally passed the exam, and they are still being tested. The Royal Knights are a complete meritocracy. Of all the first years, the only ones who don't start as 6th-rank students are Aster and Nolan. Bigger sighed as he realized they were already falling behind. But he knew it would be that way. Aster said that Bigger would not become a Royal Knight until he reached the 2nd rank or higher. They'll be in trouble if the others don't catch up with them and Nolan. Bigger shrugged. And the boss is very strict. The young man was surprised why Bigger kept calling him boss. Smythes became wary, but Aster shouldn't say that he forgot. He himself said that he would crush Elmheim. Then, in the fortress, there were quite a few guys who took Aster's words seriously. The boys believed that perhaps Aster could change their situation and save them from years of humiliation. Bigger put his arm around the young man and cheerfully asked him to let them follow his boss. Smythe dreamed of crushing Elmheim along with Aster and the other eternally humiliated minor nobles. Aster replied that then he must become even stronger to protect all his followers. The young man thought, Bigger is right. The main task is to crush Elmheim. To do this, he needs to become even stronger. Bigger's Smythes heard his stomach growl and decided they needed to eat first. If they are that hungry, they won't survive an intense daytime workout. Approaching the dining room, Bigger asked in surprise what was going on and why everyone was standing there in a crowd. He asked the guys if everything was occupied there or what. The guys, seeing Aster, said that something terrible was happening there. The Elmheims were sitting there. Julius, tearing off a piece of bread with his teeth, asked the young man, "Oh, so he is Aster. He hung around for so long that they started eating without him. But you are welcome to come in." Julius greeted his brother with a smile, and a pleased Lillian sat next to him. Bigger was stunned. "Just don't tell me that this freak." Aster confirmed, "Yes, this is his cousin. Julius A. Elmheim, the second son of the main family and second in line of succession, and his younger sister Lillian. They are brother and sister, known as the most cruel in Elmheim. The sadistic tendencies of these two began to manifest themselves in childhood, and then they turned into real monsters. Aster had completely forgotten that these monsters were here too. Lily noted with a smile that Aster had a rather cute face. He was not at all like her slow and stupid brother. Aster saw Lily pinning Grion, who was wearing a metal muzzle, to the floor with her foot. Until recently, the impudent and self-satisfied Grion was humiliated, and now looked completely different. Bigger Smythe asked in confusion what that tasteless mask on Grion was. What it all meant. Aster replied, "These are iron shackles, a disciplinary device that the Elmheims used to correct failures." He remembered that once, as the wingless ash in this monstrous family, he himself wore this terrible mask. Julius noted that Aster knew a lot for someone who grew up in a soft side branch. Julius looked at Grion and said, "This guy has the surname Elmheim, and yet he was placed in the 6th rank during the selection today. It's a pathetic story, isn't it? This puppy is a disgrace to the glorious name of Elmheim." Julius laughed and explained that he had given Grion a gift from his kind older brother to help him try harder. If you make water, food, and fresh air a reward, anyone will work as hard as they can as if their life depended on it. Because if they don't remove the shackles, they will simply die of hunger and thirst. Aster saw that the dining hall was full of people in the iron shackles of Elmheims. They were all waiting for the first years. Bigger Smythes quietly asked, "What the hell is going on here? They all have these masks on their faces." Julius explained to the newcomers. They all had sharp eyes like hungry animals. These were their senior comrades, so welcome them. He turned to Alfina and ordered her also not to be ashamed and to show her face to everyone. The girl took a few steps to come forward. Julius asked Aster sarcastically, "They hadn't seen each other for a long time, hadn't they?" Aster couldn't believe his eyes. This couldn't be happening. His beloved older sister was also wearing a muzzle. He couldn't take his eyes off the beautiful Alfina, wondering how this freak managed to put iron shackles on her. Julius asked Aster how he felt. His sister looked like a completely different person, didn't she? The girl stood quietly in an ugly mask, trying not to look at her younger brother. Aster called out loudly for his sister Alfina, his fists clenched in anger, ready to tear Julius to pieces. Alfina turned away from her brother so as not to meet his gaze. Her eyes were full of pain and despair. The young man clenched his teeth, his face darkened with anger. He did not understand how his feisty and cheerful little sister had turned into a doll. Aster's insides were seething, and he immediately grabbed the hilt of the demonic sword. He screamed that Julius was a scumbag, asking what the monster had done to his sister. Instead of answering, Julius threw his loose mask onto the dining room floor. He laughingly advised his younger cousin to relax. There was no need to make such a fuss about it. The mask fell right in front of Grion, who was lying on the floor and serving as a kind of living rug for his older brother. Julius reported that he had made sure to prepare enough iron shackles for all the newcomers. He smiled and suggested that everyone throw a fun welcome party. Roderick's son ordered those in helmets to quickly recruit new recruits. These are their youngest of the iron shackles. Julius warned the chained ones that if they wanted to eat properly tonight, they should all put on masks and bring it here. The cadets, cuffed in iron, drew their swords and rushed towards the newcomers. Bigger Smythe cursed. These seniors, their eyes are completely glassy from these masks. Christopher Nolan noticed, and they are not bad. At the very least, they should all be no lower than 4th rank. Bigger had, of course, planned to fight the Elmheims, but he never thought that they would attack them like that, out of nowhere. He asked Aster what they should do. At this rate, they themselves would become part of this masked crowd. A demonic gram filled with mana glowed in Aster's hands, and several senior students were flying towards it. One swing was enough to knock out everyone who came close to Aster. The young man's eyes were blazing with rage, and he really regretted that he couldn't kill Roderick's children right now. Bigger Smythes noticed with alarm that this guy also had a furious aura. Aster asked cousin Julius what exactly he was trying to do now. He advised his younger cousin not to be so tense. It was just his gesture of goodwill. A bunch of mediocrities without a single worthwhile skill simply rode on Aster's back to pass the exam and think of themselves as great cadets. When the lower classes are worthless, even those at the top are looked down upon. But while he, Julius, is in charge here, he cannot allow such laxity. So he, the Duke's heir, took it upon himself to care for the newcomers in the Elmheim style. Aster growled that that was not what he was asking about. Julius looked questioningly at the Viscount's adopted son. Graham's magic instantly intensified, and Aster sternly demanded that Julius quickly remove this abomination from his sister's mouth. The young man rushed at Roderick's son with his sword, growling that he meant exactly that. But suddenly Alfina stood in Aster's way and crossed her flaming sword with him. Aster asked his sister what she was doing. Julius smiled wryly. This picture made him very amused. Alfina looked at her brother in silence, unable to say anything because of the iron shackles on her face. Julius told Aster not to hold a grudge against him. His sister was here with him entirely of her own free will. If Aster thinks he is lying, he can ask her himself. He turned to the girl, asking, "Right, Alfin?" Alfina stubbornly walked towards her younger brother with a sword, ready to protect Julius. Lillian noted with a smile that her brother Julius was so naughty, pitting his brother and sister against each other. It had been a long time since Aster had last heard from his sister, and his mother was worried because there had been no news from her. But Aster couldn't even imagine that something like this would happen to her. Aster shouted to Alfina. He didn't know what happened, but she didn't have to do what these people said anymore. He promised her that he would save her right now, but in response, Alfina furiously attacked her younger brother. Aster looked at his sister in surprise. He didn't understand what all this could mean. Suddenly, Aster heard Christopher Nolan's voice behind him. He asked the young man why he was hesitating. If he's not going to finish off Julius Elmheim, Nolan will do it himself. He told Julius that he had even less nobility than his brother, and that it made him sick that such a man called himself a knight. The swordsman demanded that Elmheim raise his sword and fight like a nobleman. Christopher promised to burn his Nolan family style into Julius's flesh. Grion's older brother carelessly threw the mask of iron shackles at Nolan's feet. Catching Nolan's sword, he asked if the guy who swung the sword a little harder should really be considered a great knight. Nolan suddenly felt his sword heat up and catch fire, transmitting the flames to his body. Julius's menacing figure loomed over Christian, and Roderick's son exclaimed that Nolan was sorely mistaken. The swordsman realized that this magic was simply terrifying. It was so hot, his right hand was burning. The guy tried to stop the magical fire, but he couldn't. His body caught fire, causing terrible pain. Julius said with a laugh, "The strongest is the greatest. The kid should remember that." He kicked Christopher away from him, sending his useless weapon after him. Bigger Smythes rushed over to him, asking Nolan if he was okay. Approaching Christopher, the guy was amazed at how terrible the burn was. He needed to be taken to the medical center immediately. He took his classmate's hand, intending to lift him up to provide him with the urgent help he needed. Lily stated that she actually likes guys like Nolan, who put on an air of importance and immediately want to trample their pride. So she'll make an exception and keep Nolan as a pet, even though she doesn't need the bearded guy around. Julius said that being weak is indeed a sin, isn't it? Talking nonsense is the privilege of the strong. Aster also used his position to gather allies, didn't he? Meanwhile, the senior students were shackling the newcomers, and calls for help were heard from all sides. Several of Aster's comrades had already been mercilessly shackled in iron shackles. Julius told his cousin that in the end, he was simply being absorbed by something stronger. So what direction was his future heading in? Aster realized that they all knew about his claims to overthrow the power of the Elmheims. He clutched the demon's sword and rushed at Julius, wanting to deal with this villain right now. But Julius's magical defense stopped Aster's sword attack like reliable armor. Julius grinned wryly, too confident in his defenses to be afraid of anyone. Aster felt as if his sword was stuck to the magical protection of his older brother Grion. Roderick's heir reached out and grabbed the hated boy by the throat. Suddenly, Aster felt his whole body on fire. Julius used his fire magic. Bigger Smythe called out to Aster in fear. The boy was terrified by the power of this Elmheim. Julius asked contemptuously if this was all that the legendary power of the 7 wings could do. If that's the case, then what a disappointment. Julius thought Aster would be much more useful, but he didn't notice that the demonic sword's magical flow was turning into a furious whirlwind. Aster responded to Julius, who had just managed to reflect his attack. Just once. But he shouldn't get too carried away. At that moment, Julius and Aster's magic mixed and turned into a giant tornado. Julius looked around in confusion. Was it really the magical power that was spinning? What did this guy do? He looked at Aster's sword and was amazed. This can't be. This guy was using Julius's magic. Roderick's son tried to dodge Aster's demonic sword aimed at him, but it was too late. Aster struck, and a magical whirlwind knocked the smug Julius off his feet. Aster told his older cousin. He was babbling something, but Aster wasn't really listening. Julius crashed into the large dining table, breaking it with his massive body. Aster asked the senior if he would repeat what he wanted to say one more time, although the trash should keep its mouth shut. That's the Elmheim family rule. The young man asked his older cousin if he was right. Bigger, taken aback, muttered, "This is incredible." And the others also looked at the discarded Elmheim in confusion. Lillian was amazed. This idiot from the Viscount's family actually did it. No one in the Knight Academy had ever given her older brother such a rebuff before, much less rejected him. Aster frowned. He had expected Julius to take much more serious damage. Roderick's son stood up, saying that it hurt like hell. Aster really did send him flying unexpectedly. Julius shook himself off and asked with a laugh what Aster would do if he scratched his precious wing crest. Bigger gasped in surprise. It seemed like this Julius was completely fine even after such a powerful attack. Lillian laughed cheerfully. Her brother is so pathetic. Was it really necessary to mock him like that just to get beaten? Julius asked Lily not to be cruel. Julius stood up and picked up his sword. He noticed that he had feelings too. The older cousin asked Aster sternly how he dared call him trash. He played along with his little performance, but now Aster had completely lost his fear. Julius asked the young man if he was ready to die. It couldn't be otherwise after such an insult. Aster calmly replied to Julius that it would be better to get down to business straight away, without any unnecessary loud statements. He suggested to Roderick's son that he should just attack and stop wasting his breath. Julius filled his sword with fire magic and prepared to attack the Viscount's impudent adopted son. There was not a drop of fear in Aster's eyes. He was ready for a fight to the death. Suddenly, everyone heard a commanding voice that said, "No, you both have had enough." Count Maze said, "My God, you've really caused a stir. What do you think a dining room is for anyway? If the cadets are going to be so rowdy, then he, as the director, has no choice but to intervene." Julius growled. "Get lost, Maze. There's no place for a pathetic lackey here." The Count advised young Master Elmheim not to speak like that and to stop this fight immediately. For a top-ranked student and a candidate for the top graduate to use his strength against a newcomer, this won't be good for Julius's reputation. So he better put his sword away. Count Maze stood between Julius and Aster and insistently pulled Roderick's son's sword aside. Julius snorted in displeasure. Maze had ruined his mood with his intervention. He pulled the sword aside and said loudly to the free newcomers, "Okay, consider yourself lucky." The Duke's heir ordered his boys to leave. The welcoming party was over. An angry Aster yelled at Julius to stop. They weren't finished talking to him yet. At that moment, Count Maze placed his hand on the young man's shoulder, attracting his attention. He told Aster that he really needed him to do him a small favor. The young man saw Alfina leaving with the rest of the squad wearing Julius's masks. Aster called out to his sister, who flinched and clenched her fists, but continued to walk along with the others. She only turned her head slightly and looked silently at her younger brother. But then she turned away again and continued on her way. Aster looked after the girl anxiously. The young man angrily kicked the mask lying at his feet. Julius dreamed of chaining them all in them. Aster couldn't stop thinking about Alfina. That ugly mask on her face was literally driving him crazy. Bigger Smythe cursed under his breath. Damn, that Julius was a dangerous idiot. He incapacitated Nolan, who suffered serious burns during a skirmish in the cafeteria. In addition, several of their friends were taken away with these strange masks on their faces. The guy asked Aster what they should do now, how they would rescue the Elmheim prisoners. Aster told Count Maze that he had to stop the scoundrel Julius. The secretary exclaimed, "Hey you, that's disrespectful to the Count," who stepped in to help. Maze calmed her down. He explained to the girl that everything was fine. He and Aster were old friends, weren't they? Aster remembered very well the day he met Count Maze. 4 years ago, when Aster was summoned to the main house, Count Maze was the only one of the Elmheims who sided with him. Then he saved Aster, but, frankly speaking, the young man still didn't know whether Maze was his friend or enemy. I wonder what he had in mind. Bigger Smythe asked Count Maze. He is the director of this academy, right? Even if Julius and Lillian are from Elmheim, would Maze really allow such tyranny to continue? Maze laughed. He is also part of the Elmheim leadership, and until there is a serious reason, he does not interfere with the actions of the heir. Aster asked, "Are you saying that forcibly putting on masks to control people is not a serious reason?" The Count explained that they had always been an academy based on meritocracy, no matter what the means, as long as it led to growth. Moreover, the cadets under Julius's command rise in rank very quickly, and the directors also approve of this. Aster sighed and said that it seemed he had no one to count on and walked away. Maze asked, Aster wasn't planning on going to rescue his friends alone. He wouldn't advise it. The Count warned the young man that the main house was watching his every move. If Aster challenges them under the influence of emotion, they can expel him at any time. The young man answered Mies that this was no reason to abandon his friends and remain in iron shackles. And it's not even a matter of a sense of justice. It's just that these iron shackles fester the human heart. They take away your freedom, your speech, and your dignity, until even the will to resist disappears. The true horror of these shackles is the transformation of people into obedient and convenient tools. Count Maze was surprised. Aster speaks as if he saw the action of the shackles with his own eyes. The young man smiled, saying that he knew the fate of those who decided to do something too late. And he doesn't want this to happen to his friends who once believed in him and followed him. Count Maze looked at the guy thoughtfully, wondering if he had already come up with an idea. Aster told the director not to worry about it. He doesn't particularly want to be suddenly expelled either. If they can settle things peacefully, so much the better. Maze asked the young man if he had a plan to save the boys from Julius's clutches. The guy looked closely at the mask he had taken with him from the canteen. He asked Maze with a smile. He knew how he fought, didn't he? 3 days later, the first-year students continued their classes, and the knights trained their endurance. Smythe was very surprised that Nolan had already recovered from the wounds he received from Julius. Nolan replied, "The training program for the 4th rank will also start soon. There is no time to rest." He added, "Besides, it was just a scratch." Smythe sighed. He seemed to hate losing too. Nolan said that what was more important was that they should worry about Aster. Why the sudden change in mood? Aster ran ahead of everyone, and on his face was a mask of the iron shackles of the Elmheims. Julius was very surprised that his brother had the nerve to come to him again. He still hadn't forgiven Aster for what happened earlier. How dare he publicly insult him, his older cousin? And after all this, Aster bursts in here uninvited and declares that he wants to make a deal. Julius's eyes flashed, and he asked angrily who Aster thought he was. The young man answered calmly. As he had already said, he came to pick up his sister and comrades. He threw the mask he had picked up in the dining room on the floor. In exchange, Julius can put iron shackles on him, Aster, This is his only condition. Alfina looked at her younger brother in surprise. She was perplexed by what Aster was planning. Rumors that Aster was suspected of rebellion had probably reached the cousins. Putting a collar on a rebel wasn't such a bad deal. Lillian asked Aster if he was crazy, if he wanted to become a tame dog himself. Maybe he was a masochist. Julius noticed that for the Elmheim family, Aster was like a thorn in the side of the family. The director and the others would certainly be delighted, and the menacing shadow of the mother hung over the young generation of the main Elmheim family. But Julius didn't think that Aster was the type to obediently obey what his cousin was up to. Aster paused for a moment and then replied, "Nothing special." Roderick's son frowned and looked closely at the stubborn young man, trying to understand what was really on his mind. Aster reminded that this mask is blocked by magical power, and only they can remove it. They can kill him at any moment. Was the cousin really so unsure of his ability to tame him? The Viscount's homeless adopted son? Julius's aura flared with anger as he melted the wine bottle he was holding. This guy was a tough nut to crack. Aster's older cousin finally responded that he accepted the boy's challenge. But since Aster had gone this far, a simple exchange would have been too generous a gift. All the captives looked with hope at Aster, who had voluntarily come to their rescue. Julius declared, 7 days, no, 10 days without food and water in this mask. If Aster managed to survive, he would let them all go. Alfina shook her head in fear, trying to say, "No, Aster, this is absolutely impossible. You will simply die." The girl's mind's eye saw a picture of her little brother weakening and dying. The young man agreed, and then they shook hands. He knew very well that iron shackles corrode a person's mind. He was raised as a tool in the Elmheim family for a long time, and he knows this better than anyone else. His sister shouldn't become like that. The Alfina that Aster knows is passionate and always tries to appear brave. Although she was easily hurt like anyone else, she was a strong sister who never showed weakness in front of others. But now she can't even fight back against such people, and only looks at Aster with such a helpless look. Aster asked his sister not to worry. He would free her. Lily approached her cousin with a mask and suggested not to waste time. The instructor called out to one of the cadets who had fallen to the ground exhausted without finishing the exercise. The teacher sternly asked the student who gave him permission to rest. They should continue studying. Grion was sweating profusely. The mask was making it hard to breathe, he thought. Damn it! Why does he have to go through this? Bigger muttered. Oh my God, this demon instructor doesn't show mercy even to those in masks. They'll die before Aster saves them, Nolan noted philosophically. Although for one of them, it could be called karmic retribution. Bigger was surprised. Several days had already passed, and Aster was still acting completely unperturbed. Does having 7 wings really make even your endurance so monstrous? Nolan knew very well that a person can live without food and water for a maximum of 3 or 4 days. A week at most. And this is only if you lie motionless, like a doll, so as not to waste your energy. But with such grueling training day after day, it is impossible to endure without food and water. No one would be surprised if Aster had already long since crossed his limit. But he even outpaces most students. Christopher asked the boys if they had heard the rumor about what happened to the child with 7 wings before he was taken in by the Viscount's house. They say that the baby crawled alone through the snow-capped mountains, covering several kilometers. If this is true, then doesn't it seem to the guys that Aster has an incredible thirst for life? Although as for Christopher Nolan, he still thinks it's just a boring bluff. In the evening, all those who were bound with iron shackles gathered in an empty room, devoid of any furniture. Lillian walked into the room and announced that it was feeding time for the sewer rats. She snapped her fingers, unlocking the iron shackles on her victims' faces. The iron muzzles fell from their faces, and now the students could eat a little and breathe freely. Once a day, they were given 1 small piece of cheese and a glass of water. One of the prisoners muttered, "And that's it again. His body is already at its limit. If this continues, he will simply die." Grion begged his sister to give him normal food. Otherwise, he simply would not survive in this hell. Lillian walked up to her younger brother and trampled his piece of cheese with her boot. She cheerfully told Grion that if he didn't want to eat, he should have just said so. but he shouldn't be so wasteful. Lily moralized to her brother that there were children in the world who suffered much more than he did. Aster sat quietly away from the others and paid no attention to these sadists' games. Julius asked Alfina if her little brother wasn't acting surprisingly brave. Doesn't she really want to go and cheer him up? The girl was silent, barely holding back her tears. Roderick's son laughed. Apparently, she was still ashamed to look him in the eyes, after all. It was because of her that he was in this state. Alfina clenched her teeth. She didn't know how to help Aster or what she should do in this situation. She clenched her fists convulsively. Looking at her starving brother, she herself could not swallow a single piece of food. Julius was puzzled, but still. What was going on? He was sure that Aster had prepared a way to get out of this mess, but he doesn't seem to resist at all, does he? Really seriously intend to endure this for 10 days? In the end, it didn't matter. Julius stuck his fork into the juicy piece of meat and sent it into his mouth with gusto. Since this was the case, Julius decided to see how long Aster's stubbornness would last, and he will simply enjoy this spectacle for as long as he can. The magic lessons have begun. If you fill a sword with magical power, it will become a blade of incredible sharpness. If you imbue your body with magic, it will become a protective armor that protects against most attacks. Simply put, magical power has the flexibility to change according to the will of the owner. Magic can become legs that run faster than a horse and are able to catch up with an enemy. Sometimes magical power becomes keen eyes that detect enemies everywhere. The cadets will practice all these skills during practical lessons in combat magic. They will have to learn how to both attack and defend themselves using their magical power, because sometimes it is magical power that serves as a trump card that can turn the tide of battle. Aster's pursuers looked at the young man in bewilderment, wondering what he was doing. How could he summon such a powerful wind with magical power? Suddenly, the students noticed that the guy had disappeared somewhere, and they looked around in confusion. When the opponents were completely confused, Aster, like lightning, fell from above on their heads. The cadets did not expect such a turn of events. Attacked from the sky, they were quickly defeated. During 4th-tier training, cadets will be required to master more complex techniques of magical manipulation. The teacher warned the students that the use of swords during magic training is strictly prohibited. For them, the holders of the wing emblem, there are ways to kill a person even without the help of a sword. They must learn this well. Aster continued to study hard, and the magic lessons at the Night Academy proved especially useful for him. It was the 7th day in the Iron Shackles. Several days had already passed since the 4th rank training began. Aster had gotten a little used to the practice of controlling magical power, and there were 3 days left until the appointed day. The young man thought that if he could hold out until then, his sister would finally be free. He chuckled thoughtfully. After all, he shouldn't be so passive. Julius possessed incredible power even without holding a sword in his hands. And yet, the elder cousin has not yet shown the limit of his powers. After all, he is 1st rank. Aster decided that now was not the time for him to hang around in such a place. Even in such a desperate situation, if Aster doesn't understand something that will allow him to catch up with Julius. Suddenly, the young man felt that his body was shaking. He could barely stand on his feet, and everything around him seemed to be in a fog. Aster thought with horror that his body was no longer obeying him, and he stretched out on the ground. He thought, "This is bad. The whole world seems to be swimming before his eyes. It seems this is his limit." Christopher Nolan emerged from the forest into the clearing where the greatly weakened Aster lay. The guy carefully touched Aster's face. Yes, he had a fever. Well, the young man can't be blamed. After all, he is also only human. Nolan said that it looked like Maze would be in trouble if Aster died. He told him to help the young man if something happened. Count Maze was puzzled as to why Aster needed this. But that wasn't the main thing now. It was necessary for the boy to survive. Nolan asked Aster to wait for him here for a minute. He would now go get the sword and break this muzzle. But Aster grabbed Nolan's hand, clearly showing that this was definitely not necessary. Christopher asked Aster what he was planning. It was very dangerous for his life. The young man, leaning on Nolan's arm, rose to his feet, and he angrily said that he could die, fool. Aster whispered that if he surrendered here, then who would save his sister? Nolan should not do anything extra. Christopher sighed. He barely heard what Aster was muttering, but he saw that he was unhappy. But no matter how much Aster clung to the promise he made to Julius, it didn't mean the Elmheims would do the same. At this time, the forest clearing was surrounded by a squad of masked men, the cadet's eyes blazing with anger. Lillian cheerfully noted that Aster looked absolutely terrible, and she thought he would always be so cheerful. The girl laughed. If her cousin were to walk around like that at such a late hour, he would be mistaken for the undead and killed. Aster realized that Lily had come to finish him off. Nolan asked her what she was doing here with this crowd of people with gloomy faces. Right now, the first-year students are in the midst of fourth-tier training. Lily clearly didn't come here to review the material. She smiled. These fourth-rank kids wanted to show off in front of her, so she came to see. You could consider this a kind of open lesson. The instructor said he was not at all against it either. Julius's younger sister jumped up into the tree, signaling to her subordinates that they could begin. She stood on a high branch and looked down with a smile at the obstinate youth with 7 wings. Lillian said that what she wanted most was to see Aster on his knees, crying and begging her for mercy. The young man looked at the pretty sadist with hateful eyes. She had been like that in her past life and in this one. The girl settled down comfortably and told them to ignore her and continue killing each other as much as they wanted. Hearing Lillian's command, the masked cadets rushed at their friends. Nolan and Aster prepared to defend themselves. Aster understood then their plan to crush him before the 10 days were up. He had expected there to be obstacles, but to do it so openly. And now he's dragged Nolan into this too. Without the sword, he's much weaker. Christopher grumbled. Forbidding knights from drawing their swords was a stupid restriction. Aster realized that with such a difference in numbers, if they fought seriously, it would only exhaust them. A cost-effective trump card is needed to resolve this situation. Something needs to be done quickly, otherwise Aster will lose. Lillian watched with pleasure as the mass brawl unfolded in the forest clearing. She thought with disdain that without swords, they could only engage in dirty fights. But for them now, this is the most difficult thing. The younger cousin is always trying to act cool and is so stubborn. So it's his own fault. Lily was sure that because he was unwilling to give in right away, he was only hurting himself even more. Christopher yelled at Aster to dodge as he was being attacked by a very large fighter. Aster clenched his fists. He realized that this was his chance to implement his plan with a trump card. But turning around, he saw that the big guy in the mask was literally going to ram him. He hit Aster with his bald head and slammed the young man into the nearest thick tree. Blood gushed from Aster's mouth through the mask. He cursed, "Damn it! He could die like this." The tree the young man crashed into broke from the powerful impact. Aster was sitting near a stump with his own blood flowing down his chest. Nolan asked in confusion if he was dead. Lillian shouted from above to her slaves that they should not kill Aster. He should become her pet. She ordered that he be beaten severely, but in such a way that he would still remain alive. Magical currents swirled in the young man's hand. His trump card was ready to be used. A cadet approached the young man, preparing to carry out his mistress's order. Aster's eyes sparkled. He had succeeded. The young man touched him, and suddenly cutting streams rushed down the masked cadet's hand and blood spurted. The smile froze on Lillian's face. She didn't understand what the hell was going on down there. Aster didn't move, but cutting magical currents swirled around him. The young man raised his angry eyes to his hated cousin, but his submissiveness had clearly not increased. The masked cadet looked at his bloody hand in surprise. He had never seen anything like it before. He thought in surprise that it turned out that he was wounded the moment he touched Aster. His magical power seemed to pass through the hand of the cadet who attacked him. The bald, big guy realized that this guy seemed to have some kind of special magical protection, but it was so thin. The brute decided that if this was all Aster could do, he would simply crush him again. But the young man had already come to his senses. He put his hand forward to meet the big guy with cutting streams. As soon as the bald head touched Aster's hand, a magical trump card engulfed the student's powerful body. In an instant, the big guy turned into a continuous bleeding wound, riddled with cuts. The cadet fell at Aster's feet, generously drenching the forest clearing with his blood. Lily was horrified. It couldn't be. Even though Aster was only rank 4, he was already able to use attribute change. Now this whole crowd of attacking students in iron masks was not at all scary for Aster. Lily understood that this was a completely different level compared to the basics like strengthening weapons or herself. It is a subtype of magical energy manipulation that gives it individual properties. Most of the Elmheim puppets possessed only simple brute physical strength, enhanced by magic. Brother Lily's magic has the attribute of fire, incinerating everything it touches. And Aster's magical power has the attribute of cutting, which shreds everything in its path. Even second-tier mages and above will never be able to master this unless they have an innate sense. And we must also take into account that this is a technique of the highest level of complexity and execution. And Aster wields it with amazing ease, as if he had been doing nothing else his whole life. Soon, all the knights who came with Lillian to the forest clearing were cut up and unable to stand on their feet. The girl understood, there was no doubt. Even the current Aster was capable of killing people with magical power alone. Nolan mentally asked Aster if he was still going to be one step ahead of him. Lillian jumped down from the tree and exclaimed, "Not bad, to be honest." She didn't think Aster would go that far, but while it may look impressive, Aster hasn't actually killed a single person, has he? She said with a smile that this would not stop her soldiers. Did not Aster understand that? She kicked one of the wounded cadets. His bloody body shook, but he began to rise with difficulty. The girl took the saber out of its sheath and filled it with her magical energy. Lily lashed out at the wounded with magic and screamed, "Get up quickly, you useless scum!" Nolan was amazed that this brat was calling such strong cadets scum. Aster silently looked at this picture. He used his magic to cut the locks holding the iron shackles on the boys' faces, destroying Lillian's magic. Suddenly, all the masks began to fall from the cadets' faces. They looked at each other in bewilderment. Lily's face fell. Why did all the locks break at once? Could Aster really have destroyed her high-level magic? Many people asked in surprise why the mask had fallen off, and whether they had finally been released. As soon as they took a deep breath, smiles appeared on their faces. Thank God, they can breathe. Nolan quietly told Aster that he was an idiot for doing such a thing in the middle of a battle. In fact, Aster had broken the muzzle locks much earlier, when he inflicted painful but not dangerous wounds. Lily grinned, and so what? As soon as they eat, they become so obedient that they put their masks back on themselves. The girl claimed that these guys knew their place perfectly well. She didn't know if Aster tried to become a hero, but it was all useless. Lillian yelled angrily at her soldiers. "Hey, what are you doing? There was an order to beat up this idiot." But the cadets, freed from the iron shackles, were no longer in a hurry to carry out Lily's orders. She looked from one to the other in confusion, trying to figure out how to put pressure on them without masks. Julius's sister clenched her fists and growled, "What the hell are they doing? Why are they turning away from her and walking away?" Nolan smiled. It seemed their souls hadn't rotted completely since they were still resisting after the shackles were removed. He asked Lillian what she would do now that she would go against him. The girl grimaced. She didn't want to fight the famous Nolan at all. Aster looked at Nolan silently and pointedly. He didn't understand what was going on. But since Aster is silent, Christopher Nolan decided to speak for him. Lillian chuckled. With that much force, breaking his own mask would be a piece of cake for Asta, wouldn't it? Could it be that the cousin endured all this so diligently until that very promised day? She laughed slyly. For someone who was trying to crush the current Elmheim, Aster was unusually obedient, didn't it seem to him? But he could believe her. Such behavior would definitely come back to bite him. Lily hoped her cousin understood her. The young man frowned. No, he couldn't do that. After all, he was a member of Viscount Highfried's house. He couldn't do anything that his father and the rest of the family couldn't be proud of. Aster suddenly grabbed his head. Nolan asked Aster what was wrong with him. But the young man had already begun to lose consciousness again from incredible weakness. He cursed mentally. His body obeyed him less and less, and his consciousness became clouded. But the falling boy was caught by his older sister. She hugged her brother, not allowing him to fall. Losing consciousness, Aster wondered in surprise if this could really be his beloved little sister, the beautiful Alfina. There were tears in the girl's eyes. Aster had indeed always done reckless things, ever since childhood. She asked him to forgive her, even though she is his older sister. But she always allows him to save her. But now, he gave her the courage to stand up to those fiends from the Elmheim main family. So she will be okay now, and she will be able to fulfill her duty as an older sister. The unconscious Aster was carried into the room and laid on the bed. Having regained consciousness, the young man immediately remembered his sister. He vaguely remembered that she had caught him when he was falling. He sat up in bed, trying to figure out if this was real or if he had just dreamed his sister. Suddenly, he saw some paper. It was lying on the blanket, and Aster did not notice it at first. The guy reached for the neatly folded piece of paper. It was clearly some kind of message. He quickly ran his eyes over the lines and was horrified. It was a note from his sister Alfina. The young man nervously crumpled the piece of paper and frowned. It couldn't be. She couldn't bring herself to go against Julius and Lillian. He jumped out of bed and rushed to the Elmheim residence, afraid that he would be late. Alfina would definitely not be able to stand up to them. Opening the door, Aster saw Count Mays, who asked where the guy was going in such a hurry. One of the academy's directors noted that the young man was not yet in a condition to be walking around here. Mays saw a crumpled piece of paper on the floor that Aster had dropped in a hurry. The Count was surprised. What was it? He unfolded the crumpled piece of paper and read a note from Alfina. She thanked her brother and asked him to forgive her. Even though she was such a cowardly older sister, Aster tried to help her break free from the iron shackles. But now it was her turn to help her brave little brother, just like he once protected her at the sword dance festival, engaging in a fight with Darius. Aster ran and cursed. Just so that his sister would not do something stupid, he did not put on these iron shackles so that she would do that. If something happens to Alfina, then why did he come all this way? The boy opened the doors of the large room that Julius A. Elmheim occupied with his younger sister Lillian. Entering the hall, Aster froze on the threshold. In the middle of the hall lay his lifeless little sister Alfina. Lillian stood next to her, armed with her favorite thin, double-edged blade. Lily said petulantly, "Oh, it's Cousin Aster again. Even though it's almost time to go to bed." They both have no manners. The young man did not listen to Lily's grimacing. He rushed to his sister. He shook the girl, mentally begging his little sister to come to her senses. She should not die here, at the hands of these villains. Lillian said that Alfina came here to beg her to let her brother go, thinking that Aster might die. Until now, she had been so afraid of them and her brother, this gloomy girl, that she could not utter a word in response. And suddenly she appears all determined. This infuriated Lily, so she tormented Alfina a little. Aster was overcome with anger. Despite the fact that he had come to an agreement with these monsters, they tried to kill his dear sister. Lily announced that the fight had made her feel better, and Aster had just started to irritate her, but she would have good dreams today. The young man hugged his wounded sister. He realized that he had been too naive. Instead of offering a deal, he should have forced his way in and rescued Alfina from the start. If he had done so, then his sister would not have had to take such a reckless step. Their father taught them that a knight must be able to endure any injustice. He needs boundless patience. For a knight, status and position are very important. And, of course, the success of the mission entrusted to him. When you think about what needs to be protected, refusing to fight is often the best option. That's what it often means to be a knight. Even if you are spat on, even if your body is torn apart, you should never respond out of emotion. Little Aster then asked if his father really meant to say that it was okay to let them bully him. The Viscount objected. He hadn't said that. The point was to not lose sight of your goal and the right moment. You must always remember for what purpose you take up the sword, what you fight for. A knight must always have the answer to these questions ready, so that when the time comes for a real fight, he can draw his sword without a shadow of a doubt. Aster clutched his sister in his arms and thought with horror that he was too late. He should have done this earlier. Lily looked in surprise at Alfina's sword. Thrown aside, it seemed to come to life. The girl did not understand what it was. The sword suddenly flew up and moved towards Aster on its own, as if it were being pulled by a powerful magnet. The young man grabbed the sword that flew towards him, magic blazing in his eyes, greatly enhanced by the rage raging within him. He thrust the magic-filled sword into the floor of the vast hall, and streams of unstoppable, powerful magic danced throughout the entire room. Soon, the entire hall was ablaze with the riot of magical power of Aster, clutching his half-dead sister in his arms. Streams of magic swept away most of the knights. Lillian tried to resist, but also lost her footing. Julius continued to sit on the sofa. But such a furious magical power greatly surprised him. Remembering his father's lessons, Aster clearly formulated the purpose for which he took up the sword: to exterminate them. He wanted to destroy every drop of blood of the main Elmheim family, Duke Roderick and his cruel children. The boy wanted to kill them all, and not only because of what they did to him in his past life. At that moment, Alfina came to her senses and muttered softly, "No, Aster, don't." She remembered how her little brother had gone crazy when he was 7 years old, and now everything was exactly the same as then. Helen Elmheim walked to the window and was surprised to see a magical force of enormous power. She asked what it was. The Duchess frowned, wondering if this was a fight between the owner of 7 wings and her precious children. Mimir silently looked at the bright flashes. He, like Helen, guessed what was happening there. Count Maze assumed that Aster's magic had gotten out of control, which was not surprising given his condition. Maze realized that Aster urgently needed help. Otherwise, things could go too far, and that was unacceptable now. Fire burst from the young man's eyes. Now he was not thinking about the consequences, only about the fact that he had to destroy the villains. He grabbed the sword and rushed towards Lillian, who had been tormenting his beloved sister for so long. The girl hiccuped in fear and closed her eyes. She knew for sure that she could not withstand such force. And then Aster saw that a stronger opponent than Lillian appeared in front of him. Julius pushed his younger sister away and crossed his sword with the sword of an angry Aster. Lily tried to warn her brother, but he didn't listen to her, he exclaimed. So, that's what 7 wings are. Now it's clear why Aster was so attractive to these old men. Just think, he's still capable of such power, being on the verge of death. Julius asked his cousin if he was sure of what he was doing, since they had an agreement. Didn't Aster endure all this time to save his little friends? Roderick's son threw Aster back, but he again got into a fighting stance, ready to attack his sworn enemy again. The thought that he could destroy those who hurt him and his little sister gave Asta strength, and he rushed at Elmheim. Julius asked his cousin with a grin if he had forgotten how to speak, but that didn't matter anymore. The fierce battle continued. The opponents crossed swords again. Their magical power was like a fire. Julius said he was just thinking about having to crush Aster himself, so it's high time to resume their unfinished battle, which was interrupted last time by Count Maze. 2 powerful opponents, gritting their teeth, fought in the hall of the Knight Academy, destroying everything around them. The cadets in the hall ran away screaming, fearing that they too would be sucked into the magical vortex. Lillian didn't understand what was wrong with this guy. He was completely different from everyone else. Why is it that even in such a terrible state, he still fights on equal terms with her brother Julius? Grion was amazed. Such a huge magical power. Aster never used it when they fought. Is this really what a battle between 2 winged men looks like when they fight at full strength? One of the magical streams threw the wounded and weakened Alfina against the wall of the hall. The girl quietly groaned. Julius was puzzled. This guy was quite strange. Wasn't he grieving over Alfina a second ago? And now he doesn't seem to even see his sister in front of him, and hasn't once looked back to see how she is. The Duke's heir tried to understand what exactly was driving Aster now that he was fighting him so fiercely. And in the young man's head there was only one thought: to exterminate the cursed main family of the Elmheims. Aster was eager to ensure that the blood of the Elmheim main house would disappear from this world forever. He stretched out his hand and rushed towards his strong and well-trained enemy with a cry. Julius was surprised. Apparently, Aster was trying to deprive him of his magical power with this technique again. Roderick's son rushed into the attack, shouting that he would not give his cousin a second to do this. Lillian shouted again at her brother to be careful with their younger cousin's magic. Julius himself had already noticed that Aster was changing his magic. He watched the young man with interest. Duke Roderick's eldest son tensed up, looking questioningly at the stubborn boy, trying to understand what he was doing. Aster's magical currents began to change shape, approaching the wary Julius. And then he realized that Aster's magic was a cut. Julius felt a wave of cuts rise up his body, tearing his clothes to shreds and causing wounds all over his body. The young Duke tensed up, as if he had become the center of a raging, huge fire, his clothes flying in all directions. The streams of magic from the opponents swept away everything in their path, scattering and breaking furniture in the room. Julius asked Aster if he could cut his own magic. He noticed that magic with the cutting attribute was rare in itself, but Aster did some really clever things. For the first time, Julius was almost killed by the most magical power. But his magic is not just hot. Suddenly, the floor of the hall began to turn into hot lava. Julius acted more and more forcefully and harshly. He smiled widely and said that his magic was so hot that it killed. Aster looked questioningly at the burning floor. He also felt psychological pressure. The young man realized that Julius's mere presence was making everyone lose their will to resist. A man with such power is truly powerful. Julius shouted at his cousin that it was his own fault for going against him. This magical power really makes you think so. But only under one condition, Aster exclaimed. Power is only oppressive if you can't stay on your feet until the very end. Julius laughed. It seemed his cousin could still speak and not just bark. But everything Aster does is just futile attempts and nothing more. It's even offensive given such potential. Suddenly, cuts ran across Aster's body, his own magic passing through the young man's body. Lily shuddered at the sight and muttered, "This guy is fighting even while hurting himself. It's so horrible." Alfina called out to Aster in a weak voice. She was very worried about her little brother. 7 years ago, Aster had already fallen into such a crazy state. It had only happened once in all these years. Then his father risked his life to stop him, and Viscount Highfried succeeded. But from then on, Aster began to stay away from them and his sisters, afraid of harming them with his magic. Father said that the reason was the riot of the 7 wings. He, Alfina, knew. Aster still could not forgive himself. Back then, 7 years ago, due to his inexperience, Aster ended up hurting his family, and he was very worried about it. Gathering his last strength, Aster rushed with a cry at his enemy, the eldest son of Duke Roderick. Alfina tried to get up, she thought bitterly. Why did Aster always try to put all the blame on himself? Julius pushed Aster away. The young man fell to the ground, but he still managed to do what he wanted. Alfina looked at her brother in fear, wondering if this terrible Julius could really kill him. Aster lay limp on the floor, his sword lying nearby, the long-term exhaustion taking its toll. Julius chuckled, even wanting to praise his younger cousin for his stubbornness. Elmheim added, "But it's time for the foster child to die already." The sight of such an infuriating guy like Aster drives Julius crazy. But suddenly the sword fell from Julius's weakened hands, and the young duke did not immediately understand what had happened to him. He frowned, wondering how Aster managed to do this and what kind of strange magic this was. Both of the young duke's arms were covered with deep, bleeding wounds, and he could no longer fight. Julius wondered how long it had been since he had such wounds. He couldn't use his arm because the tendons were cut. He looked at Aster. His body was also covered in cuts. The guy directed his magic at the iron shackles, breaking them, and then the iron mask crumbled into pieces, revealing Aster's greatly emaciated face. The young man shouted to Elmheim that it was his time to die. Magical power was pouring out of every wound on Aster. Julius gritted his teeth. Was this idiot still attacking? This was bad. He could really die. Aster rushed towards his wounded, bloody enemy as fast as he could. Another second, and the angry youth would cling to Julius. And then the cutting energy could cut him completely. Roderick's son did not know what to do. His hands were wounded. He could not resist the wild rage of his younger cousin. But Julius did not back down. Unlike his younger brothers, he was quite brave. Suddenly, Alfina screamed at the top of her lungs for Aster to stop this immediately. She grabbed her brother from behind and said that this fighting style in which he only hurts himself should not be done like that anymore. The young man was surprised. Alfina came to her senses and immediately threw herself under the blow to save him. The girl clenched her teeth in pain. Aster's cutting magic ran through her entire body as soon as she touched her brother. Aster was perplexed. What was wrong with him? Things were bad. He couldn't suppress this magical power within himself. If this continues, my sister will suffer greatly. She is already covered in bloody wounds. Suddenly, Aster heard the voice of Count Maze. He was calling the young man by name. The guy looked questioningly at the door. Maze shouted to the young man, "Hold this!" and threw him the item he needed most at that moment. The guy raised his head and was incredibly happy. It was his demonic sword, Graham. Aster caught the weapon and immediately grabbed the handle, knowing that he would definitely help by absorbing the excess mana. And indeed, soon the boy's body stopped burning. The sword balanced and calmed the magical power. Aster's eyes also returned to normal, his magic returning to a controllable state. The boys swayed from weakness. Alfina tried to support her younger brother and prevent him from falling again. She stroked his broad chest and said quietly, "Thank God you're okay." Aster asked his sister why she took such a risk. Now she was covered in cuts. But it could have been even worse. The young man thought, Graham saved him. If this sword had not absorbed his magical power, everything could have ended badly. Count Maze, standing in the doorway, sighed with relief. Julius angrily noted that Maze still couldn't read the situation and continued to interfere where he shouldn't. The Duke's son turned to Aster. But don't tell me that after that he chickened out. A wounded Julius approached his cousin and said that even if he couldn't use his hand, he could still finish him off. Anger flashed in the young Duke's eyes. It was the first time in his life that he had received such serious injuries. Helen Elmheim stated that there was no need for that, as she thought. This abnormal magical power was the work of Aster F. Elmheim. Duchess Elmheim loomed over the young man, hating with all her heart this adopted child, because of whom her son had died. She ordered the young man to be taken into custody, and Alfina asked in confusion what was going on. The girl was pulled away from her brother, and the knights twisted Aster's arms on the orders of one of the academy's directors. Julius approached his mother and asked with displeasure what all this meant. Why she was arresting a freshman. The Duchess was informed that during training, Aster attacked a dozen unarmed students with a sword. This is a low act, contrary to knightly honor. And of course, the academy cannot simply turn a blind eye to it. Alfina objected. Aster would never do that. It was all slander. Aster realized that this was Lillian's business. This cunning villain quickly weaves her intrigues, Helen added. And immediately after that, there was such a commotion. Looking at this destruction, it becomes clear how out of his mind he is. During the rampage of the Seven Wings, Aster gained power beyond his control and needlessly endangered his fellow students. Even if he is from a side branch, any further actions that disgrace the dignity of the Elmheim house cannot be forgiven. Tomorrow, the directors will conduct an investigation to decide Aster's fate. But for now, he should at least prepare for expulsion. Alfina shuddered. How could it be that her brother stood up for her again? And he was again threatened with severe punishment, Maze thought. So it had come to this after all. He had told Aster to be more careful. But if Maze continues to openly defend the boy, his position could be in jeopardy. However, the Count cannot afford to lose Aster now. Unexpectedly, the young man's guards were engulfed in flames. The badly burned knights abandoned their prisoner and fell to the ground. Aster did not understand what had just happened. Julius called out to his mother and told her that such provocations were the privilege of the winner, weren't they? He gloomily told the Duchess that she shouldn't show up so suddenly and take all the cream of the crop for herself. Helen asked her son what he was up to. Julius explained that if she simply threw her cousin out of here, it would look like he ran off to complain to his parents. This would be a real shame for the Elmheim house, so Julius will finish off Aster himself, and his mother must not interfere. Helen frowned. It seemed like she had spoiled him too much. To think that Julius dared to contradict his mother. Julius reminded him that his status as the direct heir was higher than that of some duchess, so his dear mother had better back off. Helen frowned, suddenly remembering her firstborn, her eldest son, Patrick. He was also a naughty boy. She turned around and told her son to do as he pleased. But next time, she expected him to do something instead of just talking. As she passed by Aster, she growled that she would never acknowledge the existence of the Seven Wings, nor him, her adopted child. The young man looked longingly at Duke Roderick's wife, the arrogant Lady Helen. Julius also swayed away. He had had a very hard day today. But Aster stopped Julius, asking what about their agreement regarding Alfina and the first years. The guy frowned. There could be no more deals with the monster who had broken the shackles himself. Thanks to Aster, the iron shackles have become a mere decoration that doesn't even restrain. So from now on, cousin can do whatever he wants. Even if a couple of small fry escape from the cage, no one will hunt them down. He snapped his fingers, and the iron masks fell off the newcomers present. Julius told Aster not to dare run away. They would definitely continue. But for now, let him tame these 7 wings. And now, finally, this stormy night has come to an end. Now Alfina and the newcomers captured by the Elmheims are free from their shackles. Julius went to heal his wounds and prepare for a new fight. Aster and Alfina were also sent for treatment. A few days passed and Aster returned to his studies again. His fellow students greeted him with a loud shout, "Our boss is back!" The guys heard that their boss was kicking ass there again. That's all everyone at the academy was talking about. Aster asked them to stop calling him boss. This time, he couldn't do anything. He almost missed the chance to save his comrades. Bigger asked what Aster was talking about. All the guys who were caught in iron shackles returned safe and sound. And all this became possible thanks to Aster's desperate battle with Julius and Lillian. Aster replied that Julius's whims saved everyone. Saved the House of Elmheim, the one who should be their enemy. The young man clenched his fists in despair. Even with 7 wings, he found himself in this state. Bigger Smythes patted Aster good-naturedly on the shoulder and advised him not to be so hard on himself. He alone broke into enemy territory for the sake of his comrades. Everyone knows that he risked his life and fought with all his might. Besides, Aster is just a 14-year-old boy. Anyone who would lose respect for him because of something like that? But there isn't a single such person among the guys. So Aster doesn't have to worry. Aster thanked the guys with bewilderment for such support. Bigger whispered, asking what was more important. What was going on with his beautiful sister? She is now also free from the iron shackles. Smythes wondered if they were finally able to be alone, like brother and sister. In fact, Aster hadn't been able to talk to Alfina since they fought Julius. Or rather, it seemed like they were both avoiding each other. Guilt is probably the real reason for their awkwardness. Aster sighed heavily. At this rate, it didn't matter whether he was wearing iron shackles or not. Suddenly, he heard someone timidly knock on the door of his room. The young man loudly asked who was there. The door was not locked. Aster looked out into the corridor and unexpectedly saw Alfina on the threshold. The girl asked shyly if they could talk alone as brother and sister.